Hello, good evening. Welcome to day 2 of the Resisting Settler Colonialism Colloquium. My name is Rachel. I'm one of the Colloquia editors. I am a white person with chin-length brown curly hair and a brown and tan wide striped shirt. We're so excited to have you all joining us. Before we get started, we'd like to make sure everyone has what they need to access the event. So thank you for your patience as we do that.
Hola y bienvenidos a Resistir el Colonialismo de Asentamiento. Si desea escuchar este evento en español, haga clic en el botón en la parte inferior de la pantalla que dice Interpretación y seleccione Español. También recomendamos que haga clic en Silenciar audio original o Mute Original Audio para que solo escuche la interpretación en español y no el audio original en inglés. Si no ve el botón Interpretación, haga clic en el botón que dice More o Más y la interpretación debería ser una de las opciones ahí. Si tiene problemas para conectarse al canal en español, háganoslo saber enviándonos una pregunta haciendo clic en el botón Q&A o Q&A, donde están las burbujas de conversación en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Gracias.
If you would like to use the closed captioning feature, please click on the button at the bottom of your screen that says Live Captioning or CC, and you should begin seeing the captions at the bottom of the screen. In addition, everyone should be able to see the American Sign Language interpreter currently and throughout the event. If you have trouble accessing closed captioning or any trouble seeing the ASL interpreter, please let us know by clicking on the Q&A button and writing us a question. If you have any other issues accessing the event, please let us know through the Q&A feature or by emailing us at rlsccolloquium2022@gmail.com, and we will do our best to assist you. This information is also going to be made available in the chat box. Before we begin, we also want to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded land of the Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. New York University and the Review of Law and Social Change also acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. And now I would love to introduce one of our editors-in-chief of the Review of Law and Social Change, Andrea Green.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon. I'm Andrea Green, and I'm one of the editors-in-chief of the NYU Review of Law and Social Change. I'm a white woman with long, dark brown hair in a low ponytail, and I'm wearing a dark blue, long-sleeve shirt with white polka dots. I'm here with Rachel Lindy, Camara Stokes-Hudson, and Rebecca Hutchinson, our journal's tremendous colloquia editors. Welcome to day 2 of Resisting Settler Colonialism, a 2-part colloquium bringing together 20 organizers, legal practitioners, and activist scholars to confront the United States' role as a settler colonial society and explore the ways in which settler colonialism manifests itself in its laws, policies, and practices. Each year, our journal hosts a colloquium on a complex and timely social justice topic with the goal of centering conversations that have otherwise been on the fringes of legal academia. I am so proud of the work our colloquium editors and the colloquium committee have done to continue this tradition and further the mission of social change to advance radical progressive scholarship. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Rebecca, Rachel, and Camara, as well as the many staff editors who have worked tirelessly over the last 6 months to put this colloquium together. This event would not be possible without our partners, BALSA, the Center on Race and Inequality, Color, DALSA, Immigrant Rights Project, LSJP, NLG, Outlaw, SALSA, SRP, and WALK, and more than 20 co-sponsoring student groups which are listed in the program. Today, we will hear from 2 amazing panels, each running approximately 90 minutes. You can find additional information on each panelist in the program. Each panel will leave time for questions at the end, and you can send your questions throughout the panel by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen or by emailing rlsccolloquium2022@gmail.com. If you are an attorney seeking continuing legal education credits in New York State, you must have registered with us in advance of the event, and you must be logged into Zoom with the same email address you provided to us prior to joining the event. We will periodically announce and display for approximately 30 seconds CLE codes that you must write down and provide to us after the event in order to receive credit for attending. Each code will be read twice. With that, we will turn things over to our Day 2 opening panel, Reclaiming Decolonial Sovereignty, to discuss current fights for Indigenous sovereignty over lands with a large population of settlers and US-based advocacy in defense of Indigenous people. This panel is moderated by Nadia, Ben-Youssef. A human rights lawyer by training, Nadia currently serves as the Advocacy Director at the Center for Constitutional Rights, a radical legal and advocacy organization working with social movements to dismantle racism, cis-heteropatriarchy, economic oppression, and abusive state practices. Central to Nadia's life work is a commitment to the liberation of Palestine, and she is a proud co-founder of the Adala Justice Project. Nadia is happiest when she is dreaming and building with co-conspirators towards horizons of abolition, decolonization, and collective flourishing. You can read her bio in full in the program. Take it away, Nadia.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and to all the student organizers for this amazing colloquium. Mabruk, congratulations. This is really exciting and such a critical conversation. As Andrea said, I'm the Advocacy Director at the Center for Constitutional Rights, calling from the unceded Lenapehoking. I am an Arab woman with my ancestors' curly dark brown hair, which is now shoulder length, and I'm wearing a colorful flower print shirt in my home office. And I'm so honored to be moderating the first panel of today called Reclaiming Decolonial Sovereignty. And what I shared with the panelists is a hope that we can speak about how Indigenous people are organizing for sovereignty and decolonization, consider the ideological and institutional forces that are blocking our efforts or attempting to block our efforts, and then discuss effective strategies for achieving land back. We are joined by a remarkable group of panelists, scholars, organizers, artists, and lawyers. And I'm going to ask them first to introduce themselves and to share anything about who they are that they want you to know, as well as a visual description. And then we'll get started. We'll jump right in. So I'm going to ask Corrina to start us off.
In our Chochenyo language, I said, good day. My name is Corrina Gould. I'm the tribal chair and spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of Lisjan. I'm also the co-director and co-founder of the Sogorea Land Trust, the first urban Indigenous women-led land trust in the country. I am a small, brown, chunky Native woman that is wearing a black t-shirt with Indian land on it and a denim shirt. And I am so happy to be a part of this panel discussion today.
Thank you so much, Corrina. Jamaica.
Aloha mai kākou o wauno o Jamaica he o limali kalani Osorio he kupono ka aina o Palolo ka ualili lehua a ka makani wai o Ma'o. Aloha kākou, my name is Jamaica he o limali kalani Osorio. I hail originally from Palolo Valley on the island of Oahu in the center of the beautiful blue Pacific Ocean. I am a light-skinned Hawaiian woman with short faux hawk sitting in my daughter's nursery. So there's all kinds of nursery things behind me. And I am an assistant professor of Indigenous and Native Hawaiian politics, a longtime Native Hawaiian activist, artist, dreamer, and rabble rouser. And I am excited to be here.
Beautiful, thank you. Boris.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good early evening. Buenas tardes. Me llamo Boris Santos. My name is Boris Santos, he, him. I am also short, brown skin, Latino has Dominican, Salvadoran background, male with short hair and a checkered sort of blue, white, and purple shirt. I am an early childhood educator, a former city and state legislative staffer, and currently the treasurer of the East New York Community Land Trust. It's good to be with you.
Boris, thank you. Radhika.
Hi, everyone. My name is Radhika Sainath. I am a slightly above average woman with brown skin of Indian descent, and I've got shoulder length curly black hair. I'm wearing large gold earrings and a navy blue top. I am a senior staff attorney at Palestine Legal and longtime activist on the issue of Palestinian freedom and labor rights activist as well.
Thank you, Radhika. And last but not least, Mari.
Hello, everyone. Mari. I am actually a professor at the Gallatin School of Individualized Study at NYU, where I teach courses on many things, including feminist and decolonial imaginaries, courses on colonialism and the US empire and other things. I am also a diasporic Viequense. So Vieques is an island of the Puerto Rican archipelago, so I am Puerto Rican. I'm a Puerto Rican woman of color with short curly hair and a white shirt. And I have been over the years, been engaged in different community initiatives, mostly revolving around Vieques, both in New York and in Vieques. And my cat wants to make an intervention, I'm sorry. I lost my train. Oh, yeah. And then the last thing I will say is that I've also been involved in peace activism, peace movements, and transnational solidarity networks around anti-militarism. Thank you.
Thank you, Mari. Thank you all. I hope you are so excited for this conversation because on the introductions alone, there's so much that we can explore about the tactics and strategies we can use to get land back. What do decolonization struggles look like on Turtle Island in the Pacific, Puerto Rico, Palestine? This is the conversation that we need to be having. So I'm so excited that we're here together and also centering it on the story of ourselves. Who are you? And I hope our audience is asking themselves that question too, in a critical way. Who am I? What power do I have? Where am I complicit in harm? What can I uproot in myself? How can I be in principled solidarity with others? And knowing thyself is key. It's the first step to address what is it that we have to unlearn? What is it that we lean into? What are the gifts and joys that we bring to this struggle? So thank you for sharing that. And I want to start, we're going to go in the same order for this first kind of opening question, which is going to ground our discussion and invite you to share a bit more, if you want, about the ongoing struggle for Indigenous sovereignty in which you root yourself and your work. So how you're showing up today, and particularly interested in what shift is occupying your attention. And what I mean by that is the shifts maybe in public narrative, or a shift in tactic or strategy of Indigenous resistance, or on a more negative front, kind of settler backlash that's occupying your attention, or political developments that you want us to pay attention to. So this can be promising or concerning, but I'm looking for the shift that you want us to know about in your particular struggle. So Corrina, if you wouldn't mind starting us off.
I think we should go in alphabetical order. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. I think I want to talk about the work that we've been doing for over 2.5 decades in my home territory. So I didn't explain when I introduced myself that I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. My ancestors on the East Bay side of the Bay and have been here since the beginning of time. The mountain behind me is Tuyshtak, and Tuyshtak is now known as Mount Diablo. And so as Indigenous people, we are connected to our mountain and our waterway. Our waterway is Lisjan. We are named after the Confederated villages of Lisjan. Our tribal people are made up of 5 of the tribes that were enslaved at Mission San Jose and Mission Dolores in San Francisco. And the colonization that happened in California was much different than what happened on the East Coast. And I think that we don't talk about that enough in the history that's we're sometimes available to us. And so I spend a lot of time demystifying the missionization romantic period that happened in our territories and talk about the 3 waves of genocide that have happened here. And so I often say, well, when we talk about history in California, we think that it all happened around the same time as everything else, in this wave of settler colonialism that happened on this land of Turtle Island, and it didn't. In 1776, when they were starting to build the mission of Mission Dolores in San Francisco, 1776 is the same time they were signing the Declaration of Independence on the other side of the country. We did not have the same settlers here that came here to our territories first. And so that mission period began the destruction and disintegration of California Native people from the bottom of California up past San Francisco Bay to Solano. And that lasted for 99 years of enslavement of Native people with the language and spirituality taken away. And we have to think about settler colonialism and what is it that they came for? What do people come to our lands for? And how did the land get taken? And we think about the lands that were taken from us. What did they take first? They take away the spiritual context. They take away people's connection to the land and to their land bases in that way. And they try to inform our decisions and who we are as human beings through this new lens of, so they take away our spiritual practices. And when they do that, they take away also the strength of women and and how we have been a part of the spirituality and the complex societies that we had in our lands. And so we don't talk about that. Move forward 99 years after Spanish left, and there was this Mexican rancho period. So huge swaths of our land was given away to Mexican soldiers that won the battle against Spain and got their independence. And our ancestors went quite literally from being slaves at these missions to being slaves at these ranchos. There was no land to go back to. The land had already been dispersed amongst us. And so we became slaves at these ranchos, and the time period of the rancho period, they stopped writing about us. The Spanish, the Catholic Church wrote a lot about us, kept really good records on who they took from which villages and who was forced to marry who and what, and who died and who was born. But when during the Mexican rancho period, that stopped. And so that began the disintegration of our people by not being in written form. And then the ongoing occupation of what is now called the United States, because our land was never ceded to any of these 3 governments. And the state of California was created on laws that was about mass extermination of California Native people, and was funded by federal dollars of $1.4 million to kill Native people $5 a head and 25 cents a year. And so we don't talk about these histories and this ongoing running of genocide, and then the continuous paper genocide of our people by only mentioning us in 4th grade history, and then we disappear from the imagination. We become invisibilized. And so our ancestors, our elders had run from these genocides, had decided that it was easier to be Mexican. It was easier to pretend you were somebody that you weren't in order for us not to be killed off. It has only been in my lifetime that we have been able to begin to tell our true histories, to stand up and to have people other than ourselves acknowledge that we still exist. We are not a federally recognized tribe, and therefore we do not have government-to-government relationships with the United States government. And so what happens when you become something that they say you're not? What happens who are you then? if you're not connected to your mountain, to your waterway, to your ancestors that are buried in this land, the ancestors that have been praying for you for thousands and thousands of years. And so it has been our fight to really bring awareness to the Bay Area about these ancestors that have been stolen and hoarded away in institutions, not to be buried in our own land base. And that's really how we began to do this work around Sogorea Land Trust, it was a time, how do you get 9,000 ancestral remains returned from UC Berkeley and not have a land base to put them back in? We became homeless in our own homelands, and therefore we needed to ensure that there was land for our ancestors to come back to. But not only that, it was also a time in history where women, Indigenous women leadership needed to happen, that there needed to be balance brought back into the lands, that we needed to re-engage not only our tribal people in our ancestral callings and cultural belief systems and practices, but everyone that now lives in our territory. What is their responsibility as settlers on our land to the Indigenous people, to the waterways and to the land? What is their responsibility to ensure that there's a continuation, that there is an importance to giving land back to Indigenous people, and not about this fear of what's going to happen if their land is returned, but how does that actually correlate with us all surviving in this world, that Indigenous people have practices and spiritual ways of being on this land that had lasted for thousands and thousands of years prior to them being here. And so the first urban Indigenous women-led land trust was created to just do that work. And I'm done with my time.
Yeah, never. And thank you for that, Corrina, and the trajectory. And I think the shift that you're talking about is greater recognition, organizing, Indigenous-led resistance, kind of shifting both material conditions and discourse, but also you raised, the infrastructure of a settler colonial nation state that make this resistance and reclamation so difficult. The laws, you talked about federal recognition, you talked about the, resources, federal resources. So thank you for lifting up, the shift that we need to be recognizing, this sort of the importance of telling your history and your story. So thank you for that. And Jamaica, thinking about this shift again.
Yeah, mahalo. There's a few things that I think in the last few years that I've been noticing. The first, of course, is a good shift, or it's recognition of a horrible violence, but it's a good shift in that I feel like more people in Hawaii in particular, and perhaps across Turtle Island, are becoming more aware or more willing to see the different mechanisms of the violence of the state, right? This has been caused by all kinds of outrageous acts of state violence, whether we're talking about from Standing Rock to Mauna Awakea to Black Lives Matter protests and demonstrations across not just Turtle Island, but across the world. More and more, as we would call them, maka'ainana, common people, are starting to see visibly the violence of the state. More and more people who are implicated and protected by that violence are starting to see and become aghast by that violence. And so that, I think, is a really important shift to recognize in a place like Hawaii, where we have been raised and taught to think over and over of Hawaii as a multicultural racial paradise, which is obviously a lie that was told to sell statehood. The other really big shift we're seeing in Hawaii, I've been really lucky to be involved in, activism around land restoration and Hawaiian sovereignty since the time that I was born, just kind of surrounded by these movements. And one of the things that's been really powerful to witness is the growing intention around rooting our organizing and our movement work in, our mo'olelo, our stories, our histories, our values, our teachings, our epistemologies, as not just ornamental to the struggle, but central to the struggle. And this is not, I don't mean to say that this is brand new in the last decade, but the knowledge we have in 2020, the 2020s and on, about our history, about our language, both ancient and recent, all of that is so much deeper than it was in the time that my father was organizing in the 1970s. And so I think about how powerful, you can look at the example of folks who are familiar with the movement to protect Mauna that has been going on for over a decade, but most notably kind of grew to international attention in 2019, where we consecrated a pu'uhonua, a place of refuge, a traditional place of refuge. And we followed our ceremonial teachings to mark that area, to I don't know how to say this in English, but to like protect the mana of that place, and to name our jurisdiction essentially, and how that became both gathering site and site of resistance towards the settler state, towards the occupying, the ongoing military occupation that exists in Hawaii. And I think of the way that all of this knowledge that we have, that truly we only have because, as one of my friends says, Havani Rio, she says, we only know our chants because one person refused to stop chanting. Right? We only know our hula because at least one person refused to stop dancing. We know these mo'olelo because one person refused to stop telling them. And in the 1970s and the 1980s, growing organizing around the protection of natural resources like Kaho'olawe that was bombed by the US military starting in World War II. There were people of that time period who realized we also need to invest in the education of our lahui, of our people, to reinvest in Hawaiian language, to reinvest in these cultural teachings. And now we are the benefactors of it, right? I come from the first generation raised in Hawaiian language immersion schools. And so what is possible on our front line is almost unimaginable, unintelligible even to two generations, maybe even one generation before. And I see this as a way that we not only remind ourselves, it's a position of strength, right? We remind ourselves of why we want ea, why we want liberation and sovereignty, because of our connection to our aina and our connection to each other, but also how powerful an image and experience we offer to the great many settlers and hopefully soon to be settler allies in Hawaii, because Hawaiians are surely way outnumbered, to show them, not just tell them that we come from a better way to live, but we can continue to live this better way in relationship to our land, in relationship to each other. So that's been challenged by COVID, like everyone else's movements. COVID is throwing everything into all kinds of problems, but I think that's been a really huge shift in terms of our position of strength and how we organize. And I'm excited to see how we can continue to do that work and support others in doing work and organizing that is both specific to the needs and addressing the harms that are being committed on whatever land and peoples that they're being committed, but also specifically tied to the land. Because that power up until this point, I think, has never been beaten, that the power of the land. So I'm pretty stoked that we're continuing to move in that direction.
Oh, thank you so much for that. And I want us to dive in, if we can, a bit more into those openings and this moment. Where is it? Where is the empire trembling? Like, where is it working? And then where can we push? And I just want to lift up Professor Audra Simpson's idea of Indigenous refusal, and how it is an ongoing refusal of the settler colonial project. It's an ongoing refusal of the reality that exists today. And it's as so long as that settler colonial reality exists, there will be Indigenous refusal. And so I love that, grateful for that. And Boris, I would love for you to tell us a bit about the shifts that are occupying your attention right now.
I just want to quickly make a remark about how I'm so inspired by the people that I'm on this panel with. Y'all are all badasses, and just I knew it was gonna be good, but it's one of those things when you come on and you're like, okay, yeah, it's great. But I want to focus a little bit on our shared histories and add on to what Corrina and Jamaica were saying, are alluding to when it comes to their geographical sort of struggles and challenges of what they're fighting on in their lands. And make a quick remark to sort of back at colonial settler times, and then fast forward to East New York in the 50s and talk about that shift of the systems. So when you talk about colonial settlers, what they brought here, right? They brought here slaves, they brought here genocide, they brought here systems of, one, the political system of republic, a representative republic, and also an economic system of capitalism, right? When you fast forward to modern day, all the way throughout time, you look at why BIPOC people have been oppressed and everything. It's linked through all of that. You talk about the isms, racism, sexism is linked to that. But one of the things I see shifting is the systems. I see shifting the systems of private property. I see shifting capitalism. I see shifting the political representative system of the republic that we have now throughout city, state, and federal, to working for people, that have been oppressed. And I want to quickly say, so East New York, so you talk about when, colonial settlers have arrived throughout, there's been like injustices, right? Social, economic injustices. And in East New York, we're talking about one of the big books that, if anyone wants to read, is you can't see it here, but How East New York Became a Ghetto by Walter Thabit. It has a good telling of East New York, how it became a ghetto, where he talks about an urban environment that has been sapped of investments, right? Has been divested. But he also talks about the redlining that occurred, right? And also the block busting that came. So you had a couple of Black or brown people move in, and then you brokers say, hey, ethnic whites, people are moving, these people are moving, and that happened. And then guess what? The only folks that were allowed capital and mortgages and FHA loans, right, and the GI Bill, and going towards Long Island, right, and drawing a red line were whites, right? So you start creating a brown and Black pocket in East Brooklyn. You move, a white flight occurs. You also don't allow for Black and brown people to thrive, right? Mortgages weren't given, and if they were given, they were given in ludicrous ways where folks didn't have the amount to pay, and guess what? That was a foreclosure waiting to happen, right? So this is where we were at, right? And we talk about the stripping of land, and nowadays Brooklyn is hot. The housing market is hot. You see gentrification has seeped from my hometown, where I'm originally from, which is Williamsburg, and doesn't look like the Williamsburg that I grew up in the 90s, right? Because of the waterfront rezoning that occurred from Bloomberg days, and now that gentrification seeping all the way eastward. And so right now, our land is super valuable, and we're focused on how do we build collective systems? How do we pay homage to how Indigenous folks lived and thrived, right? In restorative justice practices, in collective land ownership, right? And sort of that's what we're focused on in the COT, and we believe that we can shift the political and the legal system to work towards this cause. We're lofty, we're ambitious. We usually say for us, by us, and we're out there organizing. We're out there surveying. We believe in that. One survey, you're gonna get slack with a survey from us talking about what do you want to see in this vacant lot that's publicly owned and that's right now decrepit. What are you going to see in this NYPD lot that is actually rented by the NYPD or used by the NYPD, but actually belongs to a different agency, that's HPD, the Housing Preservation Development Agency, that's supposed to develop housing? And we have a homeless issue and homeless crisis. And we're only building shelters in East New York, not permanent housing. And you see all of that. And so I want to talk about that and how we're focused on this shift and in concrete ways. And so I'll be alluding to some of the awesome stuff that our membership is fighting on. But again, thanks for coming on. Great to be with you.
Boris, thank you for that. And it's exciting to hear you say, like, we believe we can shift it. And I think what I'm interested in is exploring, what does it mean to shift a settler colonial system? Is it about shifting? How does that get us closer to decolonization? You know, as we have these visions and horizons of a social transformation, an economic system, a political system that protects our people, where people can thrive and have what they need. Is that possible in this framework? And so excited to get into that with you, and love all the experiments that you all are doing and the ambition. It's exactly right. Radhika, some of the shifts that you're thinking about and that are concerning or promising.
Sure, and just to give you a little bit of background, for those of you who don't know us, so Palestine Legal, we're basically legal defense for the movement for Palestinian freedom here in the United States. We provide legal and advocacy advice to students, activists, and professors who are censored, harassed, blacklisted, or discriminated against for speaking out for Palestinian freedom. So, you know, as far as the shift that we're seeing, you know, Palestine Legal started in 2013, but I personally have been active on this issue since 2002, 20 years ago. I went to Palestine. It was during the Second Intifada when Palestinians were rising up against Israeli colonization, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing. And I went and, you know, lived with Palestinians and for about a year and a half with the International Solidarity Movement doing nonviolent direct action. And I will just say, you know, before I went there, when I was in college, there was no Students for Justice in Palestine Club. I don't think I heard the word Palestine once when I was in college at UC San Diego in the 90s. And I was in left circles. I was in, you know, I was part of the immigration justice movement and, you know, the labor movement and, you know, you name it. I was there. I didn't hear about Palestine at all. And so I will just say, you know, since starting to work at Palestine Legal, you know, we provide defense for those who need it. And the people, the vast majority of people who have come to us have been students or professors. And why is this? I think it's because those are the people who have been attacked, right? These are the people, you know, change often happens with the younger generation. We've seen this with the South African anti-apartheid movement, the anti-war Vietnam War movement. And because of this growing movement for Palestinian rights amongst US college students in particular, what we saw at Palestine Legal was this organized attempt by anti-Palestinian groups to try to censor and punish people on US college campuses. And so about 80 to 90% of the people who came to us were students or professors. And you know, since 2014, we've documented nearly 2,000 incidents of suppression. But in the past year, the shift that we really saw, which was actually pretty inspiring despite how, you know, actually, you know, disgusting, you know, the events actually were in Palestine that were taking place. So for those of you who don't know, you know, I'm sure most of you who are in the audience were probably watching the news, but last May and in June, we saw sort of international attention on Israel's attempt to ethnic cleanse communities in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. This was not new, but what was new was more media attention on it, right? And then followed by a bombing campaign in Gaza where you know, entire generations of families were killed. And you know, with what was happening in Palestine and the uprisings over there, we saw at Palestine Legal, like a record number of people coming to us in these weeks. You know, our phones were like ringing off the hook. And what was really interesting, what we saw was that it wasn't students and professors that were contacting us. I mean, some of the people were, they were some part of it, but we got calls from farmers, from makeup artists, from, you know, therapists, doctors, children's book authors, you name it, across the country. People were coming to us saying that they, for the first time, were speaking up for Palestinian freedom in their workplace or on social media. And unfortunately, they were calling us because they were getting fired or or called in or harassed or falsely accused of anti-Semitism. But I think the upside of the story is that I do think things are changing in this country and abroad, where I think people increasingly know what's up and, you know, are standing against the settler colonial project in Palestine, maybe in small ways for some people, and other people have been there all along. But I think there is this growing movement, and it's pretty inspiring, and it's exciting to see it here at Palestine Legal.
Thanks for that, Radhika. Excellent work. And we'll get into some of the sort of organized attempts to stifle movements, especially movements for decolonization and Indigenous sovereignty and liberation. But Mary, I would love for you to share some of the shifts that you're seeing in the struggle that you are a part of and building towards in Vieques and beyond.
So I guess I want to start what I want to say by saying that Viequenses, and there may be some people that will disagree with me, but that we are not an indigenous group, as in, tracing our relations to each other and to the island back to pre-European encounter times. So Viequenses, the people of Vieques, are basically a community that has evolved from European immigrants, settlers. I'm going to use the term arrivants, people who came in enslaved, people who came in after just being recently emancipated, indeed from indigenous people from the region that survived the massacre that, Spain and other empires conducted in the Caribbean, in that area in particular. So Viequenses, the community of Vieques is a product of that violence, right? That started particularly with Spain, and Spain, in fact, conducted a raid in the year 1514 that basically massacred, enslaved, and forcibly displaced the people that were in this island. And then it proceeded to claim that the island was deserted for 3 centuries. It's not clear to me, there's not really evidence that that was a fact, but that's what Spain claimed, thinking about epistemic violence, right? And then officially Spain then said that, okay, Vieques as a colony starts in the 19th century. And then claiming that classic colonial moves, right? When do identities start? When do they get erased? How do they get reformulated? Those kinds of things. So Viequenses are the product of that history. But Vieques is in many ways, and Puerto Rico, a very Caribbean example in the longer history of colonization, that has to do with the sugar industry too, plantations, but also that in 1898, basically the US took over and kept Puerto Rico from Spain. So Puerto Rico was a colony of Spain, and then it became a colony of the US, and it's still the case. Even if the US doesn't really use the word colony, it is a colony for all sorts of ways. It is, that's what it is. So settler colonialism is definitely an issue. And I want to just perhaps mention that under the US, in the 1940s, the US expropriated 3/4 of Vieques, 3/4 of the land. Vieques has this sort of elongated shape. It expropriated 3/4 of the island, the western and the eastern part, and squeezed everyone in the middle. It created a civilian land strip. In the west, it proceeded to store munitions, and in the east, it was just bombing. And that happened in the 1940s. It squeezed people in the middle, Vieques in the middle. It really fostered the emigration of people. It wanted to kick people out. And for different reasons, that did not happen, but it did. That was the plan, right? And they made life in Vieques very difficult. And they plan to continue doing so, but the unruliness of the local population, the unruliness of the Vieques community, and the transnational networks of solidarity put an end to that. And in 2003, the people of Vieques, again with a broader international community in solidarity, kicked the Navy out. They were forced to leave. And I just want to emphasize that that was a huge win, because I, growing up, would have never imagined that that could be possible. But it happened, right? So that's that. And that entailed a shift, right? A very highly, incredibly militarized island kicked the Navy out. And then the US Fish and Wildlife stepped in and kept most of the land that was basically supposed to go back to the Vieques community. Well, the US, it's still in federal hands. But I want to link what I'm saying to settler colonialism in the now. So perhaps some of you may know or may sort of expect what I'm going to say. Viequenses have struggled to live in this island for centuries. They put up with the Navy, with the military occupation for decades. They put their life in the lines to get them out. In the meantime, for most of those decades, they were alone. There was some solidarity in Puerto Rico, there was some solidarity in the diaspora, but for the most part, people in the US did not care, did not know, and benefited from what was going on, the kind of destruction and oppression and violence that was going on in Vieques. 1999, 2003, the civil disobedience gets a lot of media attention. The Navy gets kicked out, and suddenly there's this turn where Vieques becomes the undiscovered Spanish Virgin Island. And all this onset of, and I'm gonna use the word settlers, from the US mainland, white US citizens come in. And what I wanna say is that what became a victory, and it is what is a victory? Now the struggle is in many ways more complicated because it's dealing with people coming in after the Navy was kicked out and basically making life very expensive for people here, offering money to basically what is a poor community of color, a colonial poor community of, a colonized poor community of Puerto Rico, and people being kicked out of basically the same civilian land strip that the Navy created. And there are some neighborhoods which are now unrecognizable, that people now live with very high walls with their pools. And it's like in many other parts of the Caribbean too, it's like people live in two different worlds, the Viequenses and then the newcomers, the settlers, right? And this is the struggle now. This is what we're facing. And I know I've talked for a bit, and I can come back to this about things that, initiatives that are going on that I participated, that I know of, but I just wanted to say that this is settler colonialism in the now in Vieques. This is the challenge.
My goodness, this is like the best class I've ever been at. I'm so grateful for your teachings, and there's so much that I think, and maybe I'll open it up for you all to respond to each other, because I was watching people nod. Jamaica, I'm thinking about you as we're interrogating tourism as settler colonialism and an extension of that. I'm thinking about, Mari, when you said transnational solidarity wins, that's a big shift. That's an important thing for us to consider as we're looking to a decolonized world. What does it look like for Indigenous communities, for the global South, for the multitude to organize together and shift? And then I'm thinking about just this colonial logic, settler colonial logic of elimination of the native that you're seeing across these stories and how that is being put in place. So there's so much that we can talk about, and I'm wondering if I'm going to try to do one more question. I have like a time limit in a couple of minutes, but I'm just wondering if we can get into this, the idea of what are the forces right now. So if we keep ourselves in the now, as you instructed us, Mari, the primary forces that are blocking Indigenous organizing and demands for decolonization. So I think you could go deeper into this idea and question of these sort of forces like tourism, ideological forces, in terms of the rightward fascist shift, or other structures that you're fighting now that you want us to know about. So Corrina, if you could start, and then I might have to stop you to give a CLE code, but I'll try to do that gently.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think look at the what we're fighting now is private land law and ownership, and the way that it was set up across our lands, right? So one of the oldest sacred sites in our territory is owned by a developer, and we've been in lawsuits for the last 5 years. And it's been this point of reference for people all throughout the Bay Area, but it has also been an international place that people have referenced because we connect that sacred site to Mauna Kea, to West Papua, to the Amazon, to struggles that are here. And so have been able to do that. But it's these laws that were created to take land away from Indigenous people that continue to show their ugly heads, that continue to dispossess us, continue to create these ways, these systems that we can't get land back in the ways that we need to have them back. It's creating a nonprofit as a way of getting land back, right? This was a tool that we decided to use to create a land trust in order to put land back in Indigenous hands. But then as you get involved in this crazy system of nonprofit law and what you can and cannot do, can you house people that are working for you without jumping through hoops and getting a tax exemption? What are the things that you have to continue to do, and these games that you have to play in these systems that were set up not for you, but to keep you dispossessed from your own lands? And so I think that that's what, one of the things that we're really working on is how do you begin to reimagine these laws so that you could actually do the land back work in a way that actually changes who we are.
Corrina, every single sentence, the system that is not designed for you, it is the laws. Like, I think it's an invitation. You are lawyers and scholars and law students in this audience, listen, because we're telling, the panelists are telling you, what is the challenge? What is the block? And where do you need to push? Thinking about private land ownership, thinking about the laws that are not designed to protect our people, that's actually where we need to be pushing our resistance. And I am stopping for a second to give you the CLE code. Congratulations. It is sugar 4. So capital SUGAR 4. You're seeing it on your screen. That's the CLE code, sugar 4. Thanks so much for being here. All right. And now Jamaica. So we're asking again, what are the forces that are blocking Indigenous organizing and the demand for decolonization right now?
Oh, I got to pick just one. Nah. Corrina, I'm so inspired by everything everyone's saying. Mari, when you were talking, you could have been talking about Hawaiʻi. 90% of the things you said, you could have been talking about Hawaiʻi. But I'm thinking about how most of the only useful things I've ever learned about the law, I've learned from critical race theory. And this particular thing I learned from Chuck Lawrence, who I'm really lucky to call a mentor and a friend. But he taught me that laws were created to protect white property. That at the center, that's what the law, Western and American law, was created to protect white property. And I think about how we cannot reform that. I think about how that requires an abolitionist approach. It requires a complete deconstruction and a creation of something new. And I think about how capitalism, if I had to pick like one thing, boil it down to one thing that is ruining everything about my life and the life of my peoples and the life of many of our peoples. Capitalism is the biggest obstruction to any kind of liberation. Hawaii has been made to bend over for big business since at least the 1880s. Whether we're talking about Kalakaua, one of our late Mo'i kings, funding to build water diversion infrastructure for sugar planters, right? That's kingdom funds creating those infrastructures that later get transformed into, hotel water infrastructure, right? So move straight from sugar straight into tourism. Or if we look at from the overthrow to this fake annexation, which I won't go into detail in, but you all are law students, you can do the math and show how our annexation isn't real. And statehood, all of those campaigns were premised on the fear of the insecurity of white property, right? The only reason the US Marines and Navy landed in Honolulu Harbor on January 17th, 1893 is because John L. Jerkhole Stevens called up his homies and said, we fear for the American property. So at the center of the colonization of Hawaii and the occupation of Hawaii is this question of white property. And so I think, of course, capitalism and then the greed and wealth of the few contributes to the second biggest obstacle Hawaii and the Pacific faces. And of course, that's the militarizing of our ocean, right? From nuclear testing to live fire bombing in practice. Last night, the live fire training was so loud that it woke up my partner and my daughter multiple occasions. Our house shook because of, I don't even know what we just call them bombs because that's what they feel like. And this is ongoing, right? And it continues because it is profitable. It is profitable for the state of Hawaii. It is certainly not profitable for the people of Hawaii, but it also serves to, uphold Hawaii as both the training ground and the first shield of the American empire, right? And the staging ground, even more importantly, if we're talking about the need for trans-Indigenous and transnational solidarity, 25% of this island alone is military, is lands that were stolen by the military and are currently used by the military. So all these other places that the US military are going to, wreak havoc on land and people, they're being trained here. They're using our land to train people to bring death upon other people's, right? So there's a need for us to be more kind of flexible in our analysis, even in terms of the US military. And so I think about how all of that, capitalism, the way the US military is both funded by and protects it, right? It is both cause and consequence. Also feeds into our other problem, which again, I won't go into great detail. We'll probably talk about this later, but this is tourism, right? Hawaii has basically a mono economy of like tourism and the military like making love to each other. Everyone is wrapped up in this economy. We're constantly told that we cannot live any other way in Hawaii. Hawaii citizens are being held hostage in this really not just unhealthy, but abusive relationship that's posited to us through military and tourism spending. And we're all connected to it. And that's what makes it so difficult to overcome, right? During COVID, we were told by our state, they lied, that we cannot survive if we keep our borders closed. We cannot survive if we stop tourism. We need to open tourism. We will not survive. They were lying. The corporations will not survive if the planes aren't coming in, but the people can. And so what we need, I think more than anything else, is creativity and fortitude, right? Along with principled struggle, making sure that the battles we're fighting do not make us complicit in violence and harm brought upon other people. We also need creativity, and we also need this belief that we can win. And so, Maria, when you talk about kicking the Navy out, I think about the struggle in the 1970s to kick the Navy off of Koho'olawe, who they've been bombing for decades. And I think about the fact that that island is no longer bombed. The unimaginable wins. Nobody thought that a bunch of 20-something-year-old Native Hawaiians were going to kick the US Navy off of a barren island. But if we can do that, doesn't that mean we could also do almost anything else? Doesn't that mean anything is possible? And as capitalism will constantly try to tell us, right, that we live in a time of scarcity. There are no other option. Capitalism is fueled by a belief in scarcity, and its antithesis is abundance. And so I just want to leave that with us. If I don't get to say anything else today, this idea that we need to recognize the abundance around us in the relationships we create with each other, in the teachings of our ancestors and of our comrades, that's the kryptonite to capitalism, because capitalism only works if we believe in scarcity. Okay, that's all I gotta say.
Where to even start? We need to recognize the abundance around us. We need to recognize that we can win the lie of capitalism, the lie of settler colonialism, the lie of white supremacy, that there is no alternative. It's not true. It's not true. And if we organize with that vision and we organize together, the world that we want is possible. And I think, Boris, you were helping us imagine that. And you're in this space of hope. And I'm wondering, as you're organizing in East New York, what are the forces right now that are blocking the organizing and these demands for decolonization?
Yeah, and I do want to honor something real quick, because I do agree a lot with Jamaica, is that, capitalism by far is the number one obstacle, I think. Is how we see it here at home. But I also want to say, like, as you go through life, you realize, okay, one of these courses brought it to like crystallization when I was back at American University, my first private institution. I only did 2 years, got there as a transfer student, and took those 2 years of courses, got my bachelor's in political science. But it's like the Martin Luther King versus like MLK, like work within the system versus working outside the system. And I would even say like Malcolm also worked inside the system, like showing up and doing interviews and media, still working within the system. But as you go through life, everyone's context is different, right? If you're in Mary's situation, Vieques, like I'm there, I'm more willing to work outside the system. I don't give a 2 cents, right? Versus where we're at in East Brooklyn, like most people are working families and have to work to survive and put food on the table, right? And so you realize, okay, how can we dismantle capitalism that way, right? Working within with what we have and continue to try to build collective wealth and collective ownership. And so the tools that we use are, yes, we use a community land trust is a non-for-profit model. It works through a tripartite board. In our end, we have 15 board members. A third come from the surrounding community of East New York. A third come from residents that live on the community land trust land. And a third are just technicians, right? Folks that can help throw down and give their enterprise and innovation to pushing forward the community land trust. And so we know one thing is that in New York or anywhere, land is not cheap. So acquisition, and then once you get that, what are the development costs and the labor that comes with that? And all of that is finances. And you have to work within the system of capitalism and the system of banking institutions and the system of lending and credit and all of that, right? But then you want to push the governments, right, across the board. Remember, our federalist system, right? You want to push across the board. How can these laws work for us? How can we allow for a community land trust acquisition and development fund to finance and acquire land and the development of land solely through public funding sources, or mostly through it, right? Without leveraging much of the private market. So that's like the focus that we're in. And we're like, sort of tunnel vision focus on ensuring that that's the case in New York and setting up those systems. And then I want to say also like being creative with those models of what you have, right? The community land trust works in a ground lease model. We lease the land that we own, but that land still stays under the COT name and deed, right? And after the ground lease is up for renewal, 99 years after, the board will say, because they have a robust culture of doing good by the people, that we will maintain this, permanently affordable. But you can work within that model. For instance, in East New York, and this is the last thing I'll say before handing it off, is, marijuana prohibition. We suffered so much from marijuana prohibition, right? And again, like these are intersectional sort of social justice challenges throughout time, from the moment of settler colonialism, right? Settler colonizers landing here. But you look at East New York, there's just over 50 precincts in the city. In East New York, we're not even the biggest geographical precinct. We were always top 3 in marijuana arrests, always top 3 in small amounts of marijuana. And I also went through it myself. Those type of petty crimes and non-violent crimes, right? So what does marijuana justice look like? Can we have a worker-owned dispensary, a worker-owned processing site, cultivation site on a community land trust? By the way, this will be the first, and we're trying to pursue that in the country. But right, that's the level that we're on in terms of like utilizing these systems that, yes, they were put there, but we're going to make sure that we're going to push it to the furthest brink of radicalism possible to work for us. And sort of, I just gave you some insight as to like some concrete examples of what we're pushing for. But yes.
Thanks, Boris. Yeah, and thinking about you're raising a lot of interesting questions, and just a reminder that we're going to be turning soon to the Q&A. So if you have questions, put them in there for the panelists, and hopefully that we can get to a number of them. But you're raising interesting questions about working within this capitalist system, within the settler colony, the laws, the structures, how are we fighting both for decolonization and land back? And then, what does it look like to be in such good relation that we're able to develop community land trusts and collective land ownership in honoring of Indigenous peoples? What would that require? What are the shifts that need to require for that? But I'm interested in all of these, and I hope the lawyers and law students and scholars and healers in this audience are listening. The laws are the problem. Capitalism is the problem. The militarization of the military industrial complex is the problem. Boris just raised 50 precincts. What are our values when all of our public funds are going to policing, to the profiling and incarceration and surveillance of our people? What would it look like if we changed those priorities in a budget system and in a public system? So these are some of the forces that we are fighting against. And so Radhika, I'm wondering some of the forces that are blocking the struggle for liberation in Palestine that you want to raise for us now, that you all are fighting for against.
Sure, the settler colonial state itself, period. Who are the Indigenous people, whether it's the actual Indigenous people themselves, the Palestinian people, or here in the United States, people who are in solidarity with the Palestinian people, I think, the answer is the same. It's the state of Israel and its staunchest defenders. The New York Times actually and other journalists have documented this, but the state itself, the state of Israel, has thrown millions of dollars into into stopping the movement for Palestinian rights, and specifically allotting money to stop the boycott movement for Palestinian rights. So, boycotts are a time-honored tactic used by social justice movements for change, from, Gandhi's Quit India movement to get the British out of India, to the Montgomery bus boycott, to, great boycotts, you name it. Boycotts have been a really important tactic for social justice movements. There is a growing boycott movement for Palestinian rights as well. Palestinian civil society groups called on the international community to support Palestinian liberation through the use of boycotts. And then again, that's boycotting entities that are complicit with Israel's human rights violations. So it's not about identity, it's about complicity. So there has been a lot of efforts to throw millions of dollars into stopping the movement as well. But at the end of the day, it's it's Israel, it's the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and it's about a half a dozen to a dozen very well-funded anti-Palestinian groups here in the United States that are working to stop the movement for Palestinian rights through filing lawsuits, through filing legal threats that are baseless, to pressuring universities to censor speech, to passing legislation trying to chill speech supporting Palestinian rights. I'll talk about that more later, hopefully.
Thank you, Radhika. Did you hear that? 6 to 12. 6 to 12 well-funded organizations. Like, we are talking about 6 to 12. Imagine that. Who's benefiting from the systems and structures of oppression? If you imagine that, who is looking for a decolonized future? Imagine that. Like, what is the multitude versus 6 to 12? I loved hearing that and excited Marie to hear a bit, and then we'll go into some Q&A, the forces that are blocking the really amazing organizing and demands for decolonization. Others that you might want to share, thank you.
So I'll be brief just to open it for Q&A, but I'll mention that in the particular case of Puerto Rico, in the particular case of Vieques, there's there's the empire, all the imperial apparatus that is very much situated in New York, situated in Washington, DC, in different ways. There's also the colonial state, that in the case of Puerto Rico, part of what the US did is basically outsource the labor, the colonial management of the colonized people, and are Puerto Ricans doing the work of the colonial state, but they're doing the work of the colonial state, right? So there's that. So, and there's also the workings of racial capitalism in the now, which I mentioned before, thinking about the tourism industry, thinking about gentrification. And in the particular case of Vieques, thinking about colonialism, there's the added layer that Puerto Rico, anything that the colonial state can do is up to the approval of the empire, right? So there's very limited space of maneuvering, even if politicians within Puerto Rico wanted to put an end to some of the things that have been happening, right? Some of the very unequal displacements of people and the dispossession of people in places like Vieques. And I also want to mention that what's happening in Vieques is also happening in different ways, but in other parts of Puerto Rico too. Places that, settlers like being next to the beach, being next to the coast. And there's this marked displacement of Puerto Ricans that after Hurricane Maria, after the fiscal crisis, after the imposition of promesa by President Barack Obama, keep on making Puerto Ricans and Vicenses in particular very vulnerable, right? So Puerto Ricans move in vulnerable ways. They come to the mainland in vulnerable ways. And then people move into Puerto Rico in very empowered ways. And that is something that must be thought about. I also want to say that it's very clear in the case of Puerto Rico too, that a big part of the problem is the law. Puerto Rico is a colonial state. Nothing in modern times that has been put in place by the colonial state has ever meant to be for the well-being of the people of Puerto Rico. That's clear, right? It has always been a colonial state. So the law is colonial law. And I also want to say, linking back to militarism and things that have been mentioned before, that the law, colonial law, is backed by violence, is backed by the military. Going back to something I think it was Jamaica was saying, there's this intimate link between the law being imposed through violence and being backed by violence. So you can't do away with the relationship in Puerto Rico between colonial law and the military and / military police and the police too. I said I was going to be brief and I keep on forgetting to say things that have been put in place, but perhaps with the Q&A that can come up. I'll leave it at that.
I wish we had hours left, and I'll just flag. I hope you'll have a chance to just give kind of final remarks or things that you want to make sure are said. We'll make time for that in about 10 minutes. Marie, you said a big part of the problem is the law. This is a legal colloquium. A big part of the problem is the law. And what Jamaica, lifting up critical race theory, the law was created, why? To protect white property. The law was created to protect colonial power, to protect white supremacy. The law is the problem. So what does it mean to work within that law? And I think lawyers, law students need to think about that. We have 3 questions that have come up in the Q&A. Please, if you have more, let us know. There's 107 amazing participants in the room with us. And so if you have questions, please put them in there. At least I can read them out and folks can think about them and have them in the air. We have a question that you all can answer around, collective struggle and how do you build collective strength across struggles when land has been taken in the name of white property multiple times. So when it is both stolen indigenous land and then gentrified. So building collective strength, if anyone has something that they want to say about that, I'm going to read the 3 that have come in. And if you have something that you want to say about that, you'll let me know. A second question, what would you say is the role of spirit, creator, source in this journey of decolonization, abolition, and in the creation of new systems? So the role of spirit, creator, and source. And there's a question also for you, Jamaica, but also others. Advice on how to respond to concerns from Kapuna within our own community that say sovereignty is unattainable. What do you think are the most tangible intermediate steps towards that goal? So collective strength across struggle, multiple colonizations, the role of the spirit, and then there's a question for Jamaica and others who think, what happens when folks say this is unattainable? So anyone who wants to start, please.
I can tackle that directed question so folks have more time to reflect on the collective questions. When kupuna, when elders or anyone says sovereignty is unattainable, the first thing I think you should say to that person is, I love you and I am sorry that you are wrong. The state and empire is upheld by a belief that nothing else can ever exist. And it's held up by a false narrative that it's always been this way, right? This is what we are taught. When I grew up, I remember feeling like capitalism's always existed, patriarchy's always existed, the US empire has always existed, or whatever other empire is meddling in your business has always existed. That's just not true. And for many of us, who are lucky enough to be connected to and learning from, our indigenous life ways and teachings, we know that our societies have long outlived, our teachings have long outlived and outsurvived and outthrived these systems that we say cannot be killed, cannot be defeated. And so we begin there. We begin there with a recognition of, we're often told in Hawaii that the fact that we are occupied is proof that we could not self-govern, right? The fact that we've been colonized is proof that we cannot self-govern. White supremacy, again, becomes both the cause and the consequence. The way we are treated is both the cause and the consequence of our current condition. We need to fight that discourse with everything we have, because that discourse allows many of us to get lost in a disbelief in ourselves. You can think back to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who said the cultural bomb, what the cultural bomb does is it annihilates a people's belief in themselves, their teachings, their languages, so on and so forth, right? That is the work of colonialism. And when we give into that, when we believe, to give into that is to believe that we live on a linear progressive time scale that always ends with conquest via violence. Is that, if that's the world, when we say this isn't possible, that's the world you live in. You live in a world where you believe that empire was inevitable, that conquest is inevitable, that there is no other way to live in the world. But you're also living in a world where you are failing to recognize all the ways we have won before. From dispelling the Navy from Kaho'olawe to, I don't know about you guys, but there's no 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea. They've been trying to build that thing since freaking 2007. There's no 30-meter telescope up there. The state of Hawaii spent $12 million trying to remove a bunch of Hawaiians who were singing, dancing, and telling our stories. And they weren't doing that because they love a 30-meter telescope so much. They were doing that because we were showing everyone that we can live in defiance of the state, that we can actually live sovereign. And we learned that from transnational, trans-indigenous solidarity with our cousins across Turtle Island, right? We learned that kind of refusal at Standing Rock. So I don't know, like, we always need to approach our kupuna with aloha, with respect. But that's not the same thing as agreeing with them. It's not the same, respect is not the same thing as compliance. And what we do is we stand in the long intergenerational teachings of all of our kupuna that show us not only can we have sovereignty, not only can we be liberated, not only can we live in ethical relations with each other in our land, but we have and we will again. So I'll leave it at that.
Jamaica, thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to invite you in however you want to kind of close off your remarks. And you can answer some of the questions that have been raised, or otherwise close out the remarks with what you want to make sure that we hear before we end. So I'll leave it to whoever's ready to go. Boris, do you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah. I think I just want to uplift the shared histories across what everyone on this panel is, has shared in terms of the systems that we've combated, what have been in place. I even was held accountable on the chat. I want to own about my use of language, own, right? To own. that's what sort of in some ways like these legal systems do to your brain, right? They wire you in these ways, as opposed to what we often use is we're stewards, right? But we at the end of the day, with us, the community land trust, I do want to say that we are operating through the legal system, and that's important to highlight, right? And to say that we're forcing the boundaries there. But what that looks like here in sort of like in a pocket of East New York in terms of resisting is not necessarily what it looks like in other places, right? And it has to be bolder, and it has to be more outside the system, right? And I do want to say across certain areas, we do have allies. We have like socialists, right, in office nowadays. We do have, that wasn't true before, right? Whether you say those are sellouts or not, some are more bolder. That will always be true in politics, but at the end of the day, like that, it has to be included in all this too, is that our politics are in fact also changing. And there was, there's talk about how, right, Palestine is viewed nowadays, right? And sort of how it was a third rail in terms of showing, and like we were talking about that, right, Radhika, in terms of boycott, divest, BDS, right? And here in still New York, in like the most liberal progressive of corners, it's still like gets you in trouble if you're an elected official, right? But I want to say that all of that is changing. We should work at the end of the day to ensure that we get the boldest amount of change at every generational point and vantage, right? And I think for my generation and what we've gone through with capitalism, right? The financial downturn in 2008 that was self-inflicted by Wall Street and so forth. And now the pandemic tied to capitalism as well as and supply chain issues, right? And when we live in abundance, as Jamaica saying, like we're working across our corners of the world and showing that cross solidarity. And I'm just humbled to be among that panel and just wanted to uplift that.
Thank you, Boris. Radhika, are you down to go?
Sure. I just want to echo everything Boris was saying. I agree, like things are changing. I mean, with the New York politicians, Andrew Yang got called out, right? I don't know if you guys remember that when he was like unequivocally supporting Israel. I think he was shocked. And I just want to also just echo the thought about like cross solidarity. And I think with the Palestine Solidarity Movement, it's not just like a one issue thing. I mean, it's a diverse movement and it's intersectional, and people have been really involved in like the movement for Black Lives and against the Dakota pipeline, and you name it, Occupy 10 years ago. And people are just standing up against these systems of oppression. And I would say for the law students that probably are in the crowd, imagine there's a lot of law students here, and others, to not feel like, I don't want the takeaway of my talk to be, gosh, there's a lot of repression, like I better not speak up, because I think there's strength in numbers. People are speaking out, and if you're targeted in any way, give us a call. Our services are for free.
Thank you, Radhika. Marie?
Maybe I'll say this. I remember going to Okinawa in Japan and speaking to people over there and having this beautiful and absolutely horrifying moment in which I just felt we could understand each other just because we had so much of the horror of this horrific history of militarization and colonization in common. And I just want to say that in that we share many things, right? That we can talk to each other across languages, across oceans, and those networks exist, and sometimes they get revived in really energy. They get energized, but that those transnational networks of solidarity matter. People thinking together, people conspiring together. It does make a difference. I also just want to briefly mention about things happening in Vieques. I mentioned two things. One of the things that I've been involved with is thinking about how to remember the past of the community and thinking about creating an archive that includes conducting interviews, gathering of documentation. If you're a colony of a colony, as Viegas sometimes said, usually your paper documents are in the elsewhere. They may be in Washington, they may be in San Juan. So thinking about collecting that and digitalizing that to have, for more people to have access to that history, to that past, and to compose to think about, narrating otherwise, right? So that's one. The other are initiatives more linked to reconnecting people to the land. And I'm thinking of working directly with the soil, farming, the push towards food sovereignty, thinking about sovereignty in that sort of way that has been really important. And I also want to mention that thinking about this reconnecting to the land, that women have been at the forefront of this. And it's really exciting work that's happening.
Thank you so much, Corrina.
Yeah, so many things are running through my head right now. And I'm just at awe of all of you that I've been able to spend this last time with. I think that if there's some law students and anybody actually that's out there that wants to look up the doctrine of discovery, that's how this whole thing started. And that if we could roll back the doctrine of discovery so that Indigenous people were able to take care of their own lands and govern themselves in ways that they should have been able to, that we will be moving in a different way. If you could just imagine that the doctrine of discovery is not just used in the past as a way of claiming land, but they actually used that against Indigenous people about 10 years ago in the state of New York, stating the doctrine of discovery as a reason for them not to have land returned to them. And you have to wonder, so these laws that were put in place many hundreds of years ago are still affecting Indigenous lifeways, and that there is this idea of abundance like Jamaica talks about. In our territory 200 years ago, there was no concept of hunger or homelessness, and yet we see thousands and thousands of people on our streets now. That was not something that was ever thought of before. How do we as human beings begin to wash and throw people away, to sweep them away like trash? How do we begin to think of what is our spiritual grounding in the places that we're at, and what is our responsibility to each other? What is our original teachings tell us about coming back into the circle of life as the younger brothers and sisters who have gone astray? What is our responsibility to see ourselves as equal to everything else that was created on this earth? And I think when we begin to think about those ideas, if we begin to collectively think about what is our responsibility for the next 7 generations that are yet to come, when my great-great-grandchildren should have fresh water just like yours, we should have clean air to breathe, we should have good soil to grow our medicines and our foods, that trees and plants should have the right to exist so that we can breathe, and so that we are also the voices of those that have no voices. And when we can pray over the last 6 years for our salmon to come home, and to see that actually beginning to take place this year, where our salmon have come up in our waterways where they had not been for generations, that we know that collectively in our spiritual practices, that things can change and move, that we just have to get out of the way. I think that when we bring people together of different minds and different backgrounds, we're able to move mountains, and we're able to sit together and to have the protocols that we need to be put back in place so that we see each other as human beings again. And so I'll just leave it at that.
What a remarkable way to close our time together. It will invite everyone to just, if you're sitting or still, to close your eyes, if you don't mind, and just take in what we just heard. What Corrina offered is a reflection, a vision of Indigenous sovereignty, of collective flourishing, where our people have what they need. We believe that this world is possible. The decolonized world that we are building is possible. When we say everything must change, it can feel daunting, but we remember people like Mariam Kaba, who says, that's an invitation to do any little thing. Do it all, do anything. help us get there. It is possible. Thank you all so much for being here. What an extraordinary conversation. I feel so honored to have been a part of it until victory. Onwards, it's an honor to be in this struggle with you all. And thank you for this great, great conversation.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Camara Stokes-Hudson. I'm one of the other Colloquium editors. I am a Black woman with brown box braids and a black shirt. Thank you so much to Nadia and the rest of our third panel for leading us into such a powerful conversation about the work being done to reclaim Indigenous land. It was incredibly inspiring to hear about your work and all that you do. We will now be taking a 30-minute break. Our final panel will begin back here at the same link at 6:30 p.m. We are so excited to have y'all back. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back. Once again, this is Camara. We will now be turning to our fourth panel, Resisting Settler Colonialism in Occupied Lenapehoking, where organizers will discuss their efforts to fight against settler colonialism right here at the local level. Remember, if you're an attorney seeking CLE credit for this event, you must have registered with us in advance and must write down any CLE codes that the moderator announces and displays during the panel. We are gathered again on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape and Canarsie people. I ask that you join me in acknowledging the Munsee Lenape and Canarsie community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. New York University and the Review of Law and Social Change also acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Our final panel will be moderated by Professor Jason Williamson. Jason D. Williamson is Executive Director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law at NYU Law School. Prior to assuming his current role in June 2021, Jason spent more than 10 years as a staff attorney and Deputy Director with the ACLU's Criminal Law Reform Project, where he focused primarily on Fourth Amendment police practices and public defense reform litigation. Prior to joining the ACLU, Jason worked as a litigation associate at the law firm of Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison LLP in New York, and served as a law clerk for Judge Sterling Johnson Jr. in the Eastern District of New York. He began his legal career in New Orleans in the months following Hurricane Katrina, first as a staff attorney for the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana, and later as a staff attorney and founding member of the Juvenile Regional Services, now called the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights, which provides legal representation for indigent youth in Orleans Parish Juvenile Court. Jason also serves as an adjunct clinical professor at the New York University School of Law. He received his bachelor's degree from Harvard in 1998 and his JD from NYU in 2006. Jason, take it away.
Thanks so much, Camara. And I want to just thank all of the organizers of the event, all of the folks who put in so much time to put together such an incredible 2 days of learning and sharing. And I also want to thank all of the folks on the previous panel, which was amazing and set us up for what I hope will be a great conversation. I appreciate Camara's introduction. She's already said too much about me, and I don't want to take up much more time before turning it over to our remarkable panel. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. I want to make sure we do them justice, so I want to get out of the way and give them the floor. But I wanted to just be clear that the mission of the center is to identify and confront all of the laws, policies, and practices that lead to the oppression and marginalization of people of color, particularly in the United States, so-called United States. And that endeavor, of course, must begin with an acknowledgement that the foundation of this country was built on the backs of Native people and enslaved Africans. And in the process of enslaving and decimating our communities, not only did the colonizers attempt to take our freedom, our culture, our lives, they also took our land. And now, ironically, the powers that be in this country and around the world guard that same land with their lives and fight with every fiber in their bodies against efforts to push back against settler colonialism around the country and around the world. I know that the previous panel was focused on how settler colonialism is manifesting in various parts of the world and this country. And we're focused here tonight on specifically on New York City, or occupied Lenapehoking. And I wanted to make sure that we are clear that although this panel is going to focus to some extent on where some of us reside now, that this is obviously a nationwide, worldwide problem, issue, and that is intricately connected to all of the things that we heard on the prior panel. So I'm going to turn it over to each of the panelists to introduce themselves before we get into just some general questions that I have, and then we'll have some time for Q&A later on in our time together. So why don't we start with Vanessa, and I'll just
Sure. Hi, it's great to be here. My name is Vanessa Till. I am a light-skinned femme, non-disabled cis femme of European and Jewish background. I'm descendant from both settlers and refugees. I'm currently in Brooklyn, New York, what is known as Brooklyn, New York, Lenapehoking. And I'm here representing Art Against Displacement, which is based in Manhattan's Chinatown Lower East Side, a coalition of artists and arts workers that seek to amplify the demands of those whose lives and livelihoods are placed at risk by predatory development and resettlement, to work in solidarity with grassroots groups toward community-led rezoning. We affirm that gentrification is not an inevitable effect of urban development, and we refuse to let the work of cultural producers be instrumentalized toward the displacement of long-term residents and businesses. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I have a banner behind me. You can't see all of it, but it says LES not for sale, Luisaida no se vende, stop displacement. Really honored to be here with you all.
Thanks, Vanessa. I'm going to turn to John first, but I'm sorry, I should have said, first of all, that I am a Black man wearing a blue turban and blue and gray shirt, also known as a dashiki, and I have a beard. And I'll turn it over to John to introduce himself.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here tonight. So my name is John Jamil Callis. I am a white-skinned Arab with brown hair and a short brown beard, and I'm wearing a gray sweater. And I'm here representing Within Our Lifetime United for Palestine, which is a Bay Ridge, Brooklyn-based Palestinian-led community organization that is particularly invested in organizing from here on occupied Lenapehoking towards Palestinian liberation and liberation of all oppressed and colonized people.
Thanks, John. Why don't we turn to Amin and Crystal?
Hi there. So we're both tuning in from Brooklyn, occupied unceded territory of the Lumani Namape, and I have a beard and I'm wearing a hat, and it's I think burgundy, and a sweater of sorts, and a necklace, silver, that is the whole map of Palestine, historically known. And next to me is Crystal.
And I am white, and I have long blonde hair, kind of curly, and I'm wearing a gray and black sweater.
Yeah, and we were with Decolonize This Place. Here we do organizing, movement generated theory, action, aesthetics, the idea of like research, aesthetics, organizing, action, debriefing, and analysis as a way of asking questions that then ask better questions. And then, you know, or like Asada Shakur would have said, it's like, you know, reality and dreams are contradictory. Action synthesizes them. And I think within that, we think of the city, and we think of the museum, and we think of the interconnected struggles as a place in which where we are in New York City is a strategic location in which it can both amplify struggles, but also articulate ways forward by the coalition building of folks that want to get free.
And just very briefly, why Amin and I wanted to be a part of this panel. Amin and I are both part of Decolonize This Place, and both of us also previously went to law school. And Amin was a lawyer and left. And I still am currently a lawyer. I actually went to NYU, graduated only a few years ago. And I knew, you know, as I was starting and going through 1L, it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like I was learning what I really needed to be learning. And 1L it was not a good year for me. I actually got really sick at the end of 1L year. And then Decolonize This Place was founded more or less in the summer of my 1L year. And it was founded in a gallery space in called Artist Space. And it was not an art show. It was a community organizing space. There was film screenings and potlucks and organizing and action and a lot of community and a lot of love. And when I went back to NYU for my 2L year, I went back with a clarity of what was going on and why I was where I was and what I wanted to do. So yeah, thank you for having us here today.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Crystal and Amin. And I hope we can return to this question, given the number of law students and lawyers I'm sure we have joining us tonight, this question of where the law fits and where lawyers fit in this equation. Why don't we go to Trisha?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Trisha Olaika Ben-Davies. I am calling in from Brooklyn on Lenape land. I have natural hair. I'm a Black woman. I'm wearing a burgundy turtleneck. I'm a descendant community advocate for the the Flatbush African Burial Ground. I support with the community engagement working group, Arts, Media, and Strategy. I'm the youngest daughter of two Sierra Leonean Creole parents that came over from West Africa in the 70s. I'm a healing circle facilitator, community organizer. I have a organization, Flatbush Mixtape, that I co-created. It's a mutual aid grassroots group. And our aim is to do restorative justice healing through storytelling, media, arts, and community-led activism. I also forgot to mention, I'm a board secretary of the Abolitionist Home in downtown Brooklyn, the Duffield House, that's 227 Abolitionist Place, that was recently landmarked. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Trisha. And Samantha, I'm gonna give you first dibs on the first question since you're last to introduce yourself. So go ahead, and then we'll jump into some questions.
Okay. Could everyone hear me good? Awesome. Good evening. I'm Samantha Bernadine. I am a Brooklynite. To describe myself, I currently have short hair. I am a brown skin. I have a gap between my teeth that I wear proudly. I'm a full figure woman, love my curves. I am wearing a burgundy and multicolored pattern dress, and I'm wearing gold and gold earrings. I define myself as she, her, and I am pleased and have honor of being here. As I was saying, I'm a Brooklynite, born and bred. My parents are from the island of Grenada, known as Spice Island. I'm the first generation here. I'm also a mother of one, but I feel that I'm a mother of many. I am a New York City public school high school teacher at the High School for Youth and Community Development that is based on Erasmus campus, which is next to the African burial site in Church Avenue in Flatbush, Brooklyn. I am also the co-leader currently of the Flatbush African Burial Ground Coalition. I hold many positions in the community as a community activist. Teaching is my second career. I've been a social worker for 16 years before making the transition into teaching. Currently, I teach special ed, majoring in history and finishing my master's in education leadership. It is with great honor to be here to represent the Flatbush African Burial Ground Coalition and all of its members and networks. Our main mission is to give honor and give space to acknowledge, to have the city acknowledge that our people have built this country, and to let the community members be aware that right next to them, there was an African burial ground that they were not aware. I'm proud to say that within the less than a year of the coalition forming itself, that we were able to stop the city from putting a housing complex on top of our ancestors. So to all of my coalition members and all who have participated, whether they signed the petition or helped in rallies or helped with the artwork to educate our community, I thank you and give ourselves a great round of applause for the work that we've done, that within less than 12 months, we were able to stop the city of New York for building something on top of our people. Yet the work does not stop. And this is why we're here, to make sure that everyone is aware that our ancestors will not be silent and that we give voice to those who do not have a voice at this moment. So thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Samantha. So, you know, as I said, I want us to have a broader conversation as well, but I wanted to start with just a question about doing this work in occupied Lenapehoking, and what others call New York City in particular. And I wonder whether, and again, Samantha, you are welcome to take a first crack at this, but if others want to jump in, you know, feel free. I'm wondering if you can identify any unique challenges or advantages to doing this work in a place like New York City, which, you know, an urban environment, a place that is, at least parts of it, fairly racially diverse, a place that at least fancies itself progressive politically. What does all that mean? And in your work, have you found there to be particular challenges that you think are you know, specific to New York? And again, as I said, on the other hand, are there things about New York City and the way that it's set up and the demographics that make the work easier in some ways?
Sure. The unique thing about the work that we do, when it comes down to community activism, you really have to be all in. And it's very difficult for a city that's known for not sleeping. And in this work, you really don't sleep. You're having multiple hats, and you have to have multiple people making sure that the work is continuing. So to do activist work in the city, you have to have a coalition of people, have a network of people with different talents. And the beauty of it is that there's so many people who have multiple talents and skill levels. The challenging part of it is dealing with the red tape, the bureaucracy that you have to, go through, the hoops and the hurdles. You can't pick up the phone and call one person and get an answer right there. You have to go through multiple channels. There's a lot of waiting and patience that you have to have in this work. But the key to it is strategizing. You have to strategize each move you make. It's like playing chess. So while we're doing this work, and as important as it is, and the mission that is so vital, you have to look at it from multiple angles and look at it from multiple people's eyes in order for the message to get across in different ways, but yet the essence doesn't leave.
Thank you for that. John, do you want to weigh in on this? And I'm thinking specifically as someone who's doing work based here, but sort of in the diaspora, right? In the Palestinian diaspora. And is there anything unique or challenging about doing that work remotely from a place like New York? And conversely, is there anything that you think is helpful or more advantageous about it?
Yeah, I think that particularly when it comes to solidarity with Palestine, there are a lot of advantages to being in a place like New York and just being, within the borders of the United States in general. The US is the largest, armor and funder of the Israeli occupation forces, and has long been kind of the primary force enabling the continued settler colonialism of the land of Palestine. And so being here, I think, grants us a particular advantage in working to kind of hold back that support in different ways, hold back that kind of, maybe like we could call it settler colonial solidarity from, this massive empire to this, recently established settler colony. And I think particularly in New York, Bay Ridge has a large Palestinian community who will never fail to show up when the time for mobilizing, is called upon. I think we saw that this past spring and throughout the summer particularly within our lifetime, had this massive protest campaign called the Globalize the Intifada campaign, which was immensely successful. We had rallies, protests, events that hosted, thousands, tens of thousands of people at various events over several months. And I think that just goes to show how serious people, particularly here, are taking this kind of work. And I think at the same time, there are more standardized campaigns like, BDS has been around since 2005, the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign. We have now campaigns to kind of restrict the nonprofit status of, settler funding organizations that have, take like US money or money from the US and give it to settler organizations in Palestine that are extending the process of Zionist settler colonialism. And so I think that particularly because of our positionality here at this time, we have a very important and necessary role within the movement of Palestinian liberation, as well as all anti-colonial liberation movements, to manage and hold back the kind of power and support that the US will give to those imperialist colonialist missions throughout the world.
Thanks, John. Vanessa, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, one of the things that is a real challenge for organizing in New York is just the power that real estate has here. So, when I think of what settler colonialism looks like here, you can almost think of it as the privatization that's happening now, privatization of the air. And really the way that I came into this work was I've lived in New York almost 15 years, and just watching, such drastic changes happen in different neighborhoods, gentrification and the displacement of, the long-term communities that had been there. So I started to learn more about that, and kind of, with Art Against Displacement, it was founded around the same time as Decolonize This Place. We started to really learn more about how local politics work, how is this occurring, and looking into the kind of power dynamics that happen with something like a rezoning, which is a legal mechanism, right? Where the mayor can basically privatize the air with the stroke of a pen. And it's often developers and people who explicitly stand to profit from this that are the ones that are really authoring these major changes. And those manifest, in our city with things like the Williamsburg waterfront or Long Island City. And so, I really got involved with the fight to stop 4 luxury towers going up on the waterfront in 2 bridges. And we saw, one of the sites is at 80 Rutgers Slip. It's a senior home. And the design of the building cantilevers up and over it, 10 times the size. And so, it's a very explicit way that you can kind of see the logic of settler colonialism, which the prior panels have so wonderfully described as this kind of spatialized regime of domination, right? And so, but what's also amazing about New York is that there is such a long history of community organizing, and it's the origin of public housing. It's the center, was the center of the labor movement, and has a really radical history. Unfortunately, today, the role of nonprofits has been, I would say, very destructive as far as kind of skewing demands toward concessions. And so, it's a very fraught place to organize because there's so many powerful interests and differing opinions at play. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. Trisha, any other thoughts you want to add?
Yeah, Vanessa, just that last piece that you were saying made me think about language and how there are interests who try to redefine certain terms, and how that's just so, destructive. In the case with the burial ground, the term affordable housing, affordable housing was going to go up on the sacred site. And it was something that, they're like, oh, who would be against affordable housing, but it's like, affordable for who? The system at which that they make that determination is completely flawed. Everyone knows it's flawed, but because it's just the lay of the land, it just goes, that's just how it is, in terms of the, and about that piece, yeah, so in Flatbush, the AMI, the area median income is like 130%, I think, of what, the income, and it's just unrealistic and really disrespectful. And then in terms of the abolitionist house, currently there's the Economic Development Corporation that owns the park next door to the home. Mama Joy, who was the last owner of the home before she died, fought for many years against this entity. And they're currently trying to co-opt the term abolition and just completely like whitewash it of its actual history. And it's just, it's insane. So yeah, there's just a thing about language, and I think it's important for organizers to have a handle on the words that we use and what we actually mean when we say them.
Thanks, Trisha. And then Crystal or Amin, anything you want to add on this question about doing work in this particular place and in this particular moment.
Yeah, thank you. You know, kind of affirming everything obviously that's been said, I think that decolonize this place really is never meant to be a noun. It's a call, it's a modality, it's a decolonial formation. It has a certain politics to it. It moves with time because movements need to keep moving. But in focusing on how it began as a response or an answer to that question. Because what you had is a Brooklyn Museum, a public institution that has a show on the 4th floor that's called This Place. And This Place was a show that began in Technion in Israel, where they, militarized the technology around drones, right? So that was kind of, and it came to our attention that what they did was pay 12 artists from here to go over there and take pictures, and then bring those pictures and put them on exhibition. And it's this humanist approach, but when you look at the images, you see that the Palestinians are barely visible, but then you see what looks like Brooklynites, white settlers that could have been in Brooklyn, except they're by an olive tree. And then you realize that the museum is doing something other than exhibiting art. It's a form of knowledge making and of subjectivity and neutralizing and normalizing what otherwise is, ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, all these kind of violences. And right next to it is an exhibition that actually critiques gentrification. Because what everyone knows is museums are also kind of agents of gentrification, right? And actually the history of the Brooklyn Museum was created by the elite, and that's also why you have a bridge that connects these two areas, right? Because the Brooklyn Museum was supposed to be in the backyard of the people that lived on occupied Manhattan to go and hang out, right? So that history over there, and then they have all these kind of stuff that was looted, people separated from their belongings and their objects, both their objects and their bodies stolen, right over there in the Brooklyn Museum. But you are coming from a Palestinian struggle, and you're then realizing that you have to actually think from where you are, and you're on occupied land. And whether you're a settler or you're a guest or it's a forced migration, that's a positionality in which you think with how do we move? Who do we need to talk to? Who's in the room? Who's not in the room? Who needs to be in the room? And it's always context specific, but in the context of Brooklyn, it's obviously unceded territory. It's stolen. It has stolen things. And if you're going to organize around Palestine, you have to then reach out to the local community and see what struggles are actually involved there. And how can you amplify gentrification? So the answer to the question then became that should inform how we move and what kind of coalition and the non-organizational hierarchical structure do you need in order to move legitimately? Because every act you take is a way to answer that question and build power simultaneously. So that's how that's where DTP comes from, and that's why we bring a lot of strands together.
Well, that's amazing. I really appreciate that, and it feels like a good segue into my next question, which I'll stay with the two of you for now. I want to acknowledge how important a conversation this is, and the ones that came before it throughout this event, and also acknowledge that it is not a conversation that is happening often enough, including among folks who are fighting for, or claim to be fighting for, social justice, racial justice in other contexts. And as all of you know, the summer of 2020 has been often sort of cited as a point at which there was some sort of racial reckoning in this country. I'm not sure I would go that far, but following the murder of George Floyd, that there was something different about the way that the country responded and the attention that race and racial justice started to get. And some of the conversations that started to be had as a result of that. I'm not sure we're still in that moment. I'd like to think so, but I'm not sure. But I raise it to ask whether you think this is a moment in which it may be possible to get folks who are doing all kinds of social justice and racial justice work to connect the dots here and understand why this conversation about settler colonialism is part and parcel of the larger conversation we need to be having, and that we have to come together in order to build the kind of future that I think all of us want. And part of why I ask is that I think it's safe to say that all of us on the screen here, and I would venture to guess that many of the people who are joining us tonight are on board and see the logic in all of this. And if it were up to us, we'd be there already. And so how do we mobilize a critical mass of people, again, including people who profess to be committed to equity and social justice, to really get involved in settler colonialism resistance in whatever form that may look like. So I'll stay with Amin and Crystal for now, but of course want to hear everyone's thoughts on this.
So I'll actually try to make it short because I can tell the story of like this moment that we're in is so critical that it has mirrors of the 30s and the 60s. But these possibilities, these openings, if you don't learn from the past and you don't figure out how to move together, you'll be crushed. And I mean this sincerely. Like even us, like the biggest challenge in New York City is counterinsurgency. The biggest problem in New York, counterinsurgency, we're not using the language enough. We have to go, it's not a question of a framework of settler colonialism. It's how do you understand oppression and how do you build resistance and struggle? It's not a question of like this law or that law, it's like all the tactics possible. Then the question is there spaces that can be inhabited differently? But our moment right now is one in which the way forward has to be asking first questions. In the Black liberation struggle, in the notion of enslavement, one of the two pillars in which this settler colonial project is upheld, enslavement and stolen land and genocide of people. In that context, how was that resolved and dealt with so far? And will the structure and the system as it's set up involve us participating into it, or does it need to be abolished and something else created simultaneously? This is a very strategic question because it's not a question around campaigns right now. It's a question of what is your analysis of the moment? You had 2020 George Floyd and they gave you Eric Adams. We're concerned. We're concerned, but it's an analysis of power and power gave its response. So if we're talking about chess, what's our move? And we don't have to move all together, but we need to move in the same direction. And we need to be communicating, like the Zapatistas have taught us, separately, right, together, and separately, but in agreement. And the agreement is, in DTP and the people we work with, there's a diversity of tactics and how we move, and we'll figure out where we're gonna go together. But it has to be in struggle that's de-assimilation into an imperialist colonial project. Is this right? And I think like that has to be in political orientation. Now you say, how does that directly impact the organizing? Well, one of the books that just came out, is called Neither Native Nor Settler. And it looks at the political experiment of apartheid and post-apartheid. And it looked at the technologies that were actually set out from the United States. The United States, it generated the settler colonial framework that then got imported to Israel and in South Africa. And what you see is in the United States context, They dealt with the indigenous people, the Native American population, with a two-state solution. It's called the reservations. And with the Black folks, it was a one-state solution. It was assimilation. So if you're talking about burning the structure down, you got to be serious. We got to be actual. What does that even mean? Will the structure let you do that? So since 2019, I find out from Google, I'm under investigation by the FBI. Like this stuff is like, we're in it right now. And the people in Ferguson, when they were doing the stuff, right? And the limelight power stays away from you. And then when the limelight goes down, they lynch people. So we have to come together and know how to support each other. And we use, like, for example, we talk about mutual aid. We should need to focus on the mutuality, not just the aid. There's a mutuality of obligation that is actually contextualized in struggle. So the Palestine, it's like it's specific in its struggle. The Black liberation struggle is specific. All their demands, all their contradictions, all of that gets worked out in struggle. But it's essential in our city to recognize that they are going to crush anything that is effective, just like they did in Move in Philly, right? Just like they lynched 38 Native Americans, right, during the Sioux Uprising and hung them right after, the day after the Emancipation Proclamation. This country is built on separation. Coming together on a politics right now is going to be the difference.
Well said, needless to say. And does anyone else have any thoughts on this? I have a related question, but I want to give everybody a chance to weigh in. Samantha?
Yeah, I was going to mention something in regards to the Brooklyn Museum and how interesting that they have an exhibit on this.
Samantha, you're breaking up on us a little bit.
As well as I live about 5 blocks away.
Samantha, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Okay. Can you hear now?
Yes.
Or is it still breaking up?
You were good there for a second.
I will fix that. I'll come back.
Okay, you want to give it another shot?
Can you hear me better now?
Can hear you. It's just it's a little bit garbled, but I can hear you. Maybe I don't know if we maybe try turning your camera off just while you're speaking, and maybe that'll help with the reception.
Is it better now?
Better now, yeah.
Okay, I'll change computers later. I was saying that it's very interesting that there's a exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum that I live about 5 blocks away in regards to displacement as well as gentrification. I've lived here for over 40 plus years and have seen the tremendous change around. But before there was a museum there, and before there was Eastern Parkway, that area was once settled by enslaved and free African Americans or Black people that had gotten pushed out due to the development of Prospect Park and wanting to establish the roads that we have right now. So it's very interesting, as it was pointed out, and I see you shaking your head, the history behind New York City. And I think that the important fact that when we talk about colonialism, and those references are geared to certain regions of the country. And as much as again, I love the fact that I go to the store and get whatever I want. And I say that because I went to school in New Hampshire at Franklin Pierce College, which is a Franklin Pierce University, and to get something in the middle of the night of. So I understand that luxury. But when we talk about enslavement, when we talk about colonialism, we're talking about a hands, and we have to be able to strategically put that in away from having put in place.
I think we may have lost Samantha. Okay, maybe she's going to try to change computers. So while she does that, why don't we let someone else jump in? I don't know, Trisha, John, anyone who wants to just tackle this question about how do we build coalition? And I appreciate everything that Samantha was saying. I think she was talking about the irony, I guess, of the fact that the land where Brooklyn Museum is now was at one point occupied by freed, formerly enslaved Africans. And now they turn around and have this exhibit. So it's all connected, obviously. But anyone else want to jump in here?
I'm particularly interested in this kind of dynamic between kind of mobilization and, as Amin said, counterinsurgency. And it reminds me of something that Kwame Ture said in a talk that he gave later in life, where he said that it's relatively easy to mobilize people, especially in moments like this. It feels like, especially right now, there's a reason to take the streets like every other week. But the question is, how can we take that energy, how can we take that mobilizing spirit, and how can we organize it? Because we need that kind of infrastructure in place, not just to, keep pushing, but to also be able to defend ourselves and take care of one another. Because resisting settler colonialism doesn't just mean reacting to it, it means advancing our struggle against it. It means advancing the struggle to decolonize this land, to decolonize Palestine, to decolonize every settler colony, to rid the world of this violent imperialism that is currently dominated by US hegemony all over the world. And I think that when it comes to building this kind of coalition together, the fact of the matter is that we all have the same enemy. We all suffer from the same problems, and it's all enacted by the same settler colonialist, white supremacist imperialist system. And so when we want to talk about like how to come together against it, it's just the fact that we need to make it clear to as many people as possible that we all share a common enemy and we all share a common struggle, and take that spirit that people have to go out into the streets, to mobilize, to fight, and turn that into energy to get organized, to come together, and to just be together in this kind of way that can help build this alternative structure that isn't settler colonialism, that can actually challenge settler colonialism wherever it finds itself, that can challenge empire wherever it finds itself.
Thanks, John. Samantha, so glad to have you back. I want to let you, if there's anything else you wanted to add before we move to someone else, please feel free.
No, I wanted to say that we're in a moment where we have to seize it. And I'm going to be very honest. One of the struggles of doing this type of work is finding out whether people are in it because it's fashionable, or if they're in it because they're really about the cause. It was sexy to be on Eastern Parkway and walking down Flatbush to the Barclays Center and holding up your sign, or putting a sign up in your window saying Black Lives Matter, or, Blue Lives Matter, or All People Matter. But then it died down. And we're still seeing the same things happening. Where are people right now? They're like, well, that was then. The pandemic is done. I have nothing better to do. Let me go and, meet me in a coffee shop. So that sometimes is the struggle of finding out whether or not people are truly invested in the cause, or are they in it because the season says it's to be on it, to be in it. Or this is real great content to put on my Instagram feed, so you have to deal with that. But I think we're in a point in this country where we have to hold people accountable by any means necessary. There's a saying that Marcus Garvey created, that Bob Marley put in one of his songs, which was you must emancipate yourself from mental slavery. And that goes for all of us, whether you are of African descent or otherwise. We have to mentally get ourselves out of a colonialism world where we think that this is what it's supposed to be. No, we need to question everything. And if it means that questioning how I got here, how am I able to achieve certain things in life? How am I not able to achieve certain things in life? Why are there all these barriers put in place? They're not put in place because you don't have luck. It's not put in place because you're not smart. It's strategically put in place to keep you in a position of needing and wanting, because someone else is going to profit off of that need and off of that want. So I wanted to make sure that, in coming back on a different computer, that statement is really placed. And for all those who are on this call or on this program, that you're in it because you really want to learn more. And learning more also means showing up, as well as taking the mirror and looking at yourself. And some of those things that you will see is not going to be nice. It's not going to be comfortable. But when you approach it and address it and acknowledge it, you definitely can do much work in this fight.
Samantha, thank you for that. It was worth the wait, for sure. And I'm gonna come back to a piece of that shortly. I want to hear from Trisha and Vanessa on this, but before we do that, I want to make sure I share the CLE code, and that code is 6 elder. I will spell it. You'll see it on the screen. The number 6, capital ELDER. Only the E is capitalized. That should be clear. All right. So Trisha or Vanessa, I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in on this question as well before I move to a related one.
Yeah, thank you all. I'm so appreciating this this line of conversation. I think that what you shared about just this needing to be a multi-racial force is really important. And we've seen what something like that in history, the reaction that gets, with Fred Hampton's work with the Rainbow Coalition. And I think, Samantha, what you're speaking about is sort of like meeting people where they're at and kind of understanding that, in 2020, we were all experiencing like this collective traumatic experience, and we were all reacting in different traumatic responses. Folks with wealth were just like, hey, I'm going to give to every Black-led group, and the protesters were like, all right, I'm going to hit the streets and we're going to go protest. We're going to do eviction defense and like all the things. So many people were activated. Not everyone has the capacity for these things, and we all have strengths. But I think the key piece is, again, to build on Samantha, like, are you doing it out of guilt? Are you doing it out of like performance? Or are you really trying to be a part of something? It's easy to look back at the past and say like, oh, these movements happened and it was so great. And like, you know, wow, if I was alive then, but like, you're alive now. Like, these things are happening now. And so I think it's really important that we, think about these struggles, but also from a place of like being trauma informed with each other, especially with the burial ground work that we do. You know, it's, Samantha was saying that, you know, we did a lot of work in a short amount of time. We accomplished so much. But these are like deep, you know, like this is ancestral, this is legacy. Like our people were, you know, stolen and brought, and everything that we face, like that stuff, that truth, like lives in our bodies. Those things really still impact us. Some of us don't have language for that yet. And I think that as we do this work, it's important, again, to meet people where they're at, and for the folks who are ready to heal, you know, we get to do that. And hopefully the others who are not ready to get activated, you know, hopefully it doesn't take like something, you know, cataclysmic to get them to wake up, but, you know, we have to keep marching on.
Thank you for that. Yeah, if I could just add, I think, you know, 2020 was certainly a breaking point, and we really saw an explosion of tenant organizing, right, in the midst of, you know, people not being able to pay rent. And so just on a very basic level, the number of people that were feeling like, oh, this is a struggle that I need to be involved in, just from a very basic level of, you know, housing. But you know, from our point of view with Art Against Displacement, we came from a displacement frame. And I think, you know, with the phrase, you know, our neighborhood is not for sale, we've really expanded in the last 2 years to think about, you know, I'm just thinking back to all the different moments of 2020, you know, and the way that the housing, you know, conversations around housing also laid the groundwork for people to understand Palestine in a different way. That, you know, thinking about cancel rent, you know, what would it mean to cancel rent forever? And this idea that there should be no rent on stolen land, and there should be no evictions on stolen land. And so I think there's a real need for us to do more centering of decolonial narratives in the housing justice space. And I want to lift up Emily Johnson's work in the Lower East Side, who wasn't able to attend, you know, she's been working with us in Art Against Displacement, but she's from the Yupik Nation, and she's definitely, you know, done a lot, even just one person, to shift the narrative around East River Park and climate change, to kind of, so I think, you know, to what others have been saying about, you know, are you really in the movement or not? I think there's a need to like really continue to grow consciousness. And a big part of decolonization is going to have to be dismantling whiteness. And that is really the big obstacle that we have because of whiteness's relationship to property. And so that's something that I'm, you know, maybe from a legal standpoint, you know, that's something that you all will be interested in. There's an author, Cheryl Harris, who in the 90s wrote about whiteness as property, because, you know, property rights are really conflated and intertwined with race when you think about the right to exclude, you know, and really only white possession and occupation of land was validated as a basis for property rights. So I think we have to keep coming back to that in, you know, just to give a kind of sense of the breadth of some of the struggles that are happening, you know, eviction defense, trying to stop the privatization of public housing that's happening in New York, fighting these luxury developments and rezonings, you know, advocating for rent stabilization for small businesses, supporting rent strikes and squats, you know, advocating for community self-determination, I think there's more work that needs to be done to elevate Indigenous kind of ways of thinking. And we heard in the last panel from the East New York Community Land Trust, which was really interesting, fighting the $8 billion new jail construction, fighting to defund the police, fighting for a free Palestine, a free Puerto Rico, workers' rights. I won't go on too much longer, but artists and architects even organizing their workplaces, Amazon workers organizing in Staten Island, the Jing Fong restaurant workers in Chinatown, home care workers who were forced to work 24-hour shifts, solidarity with unhoused people, solidarity with those inside Rikers and ICE detention and prisons. So I just say all that to just kind of, show how much these struggles are interconnected. And I think there's real work to be done to develop consciousness around that and how we understand the root causes of these things, which are settler colonialism and racialized capitalism.
So Vanessa, and that was fantastic. I want to stay with you for a second on this, because one of my other questions, and I was going to wait until a little bit later, but I think I'll go ahead and ask it now, which is, and all of you have kind of alluded to this in describing the work that you do, but what does a true or truly decolonized future look like? And does it require abolition in the broadest sense of the word, whether we're talking about prison abolition, defunding the police, upending capitalism, all of it? Does it require that? Or is there some way, should there be some way to achieve the future that we want to achieve within the box that we find ourselves in right now? And part of why I'm asking that, I think it goes a little bit to what Samantha was saying, and this question of how far folks are willing to go to support the movement, how much people are willing to sacrifice in order to get to where we want to go. So from an artist perspective, from a human perspective, what does that future look like, and how do we get there? But specifically, is it going to require a complete tear down in order to make it happen?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think if we understand police as there to protect property with violence, which really you can see that happening daily in New York, that, they're there to enforce what the landlords need. They're there to clear out homeless people. They are not there to serve the people. This is something we all understand. So I think, abolition is very much intertwined with decolonization, because police are a major thing standing in our way, really. I think to think about what it would look like, and the role of art in that, I think, I think about, there's the Senegalese scholar Felwine Sarr, who was worked a lot on the French repatriation of cultural objects. And he has a quote that I love about how metaphors for justice occur in society before justice occurs. I think it takes imagination, and as someone in the last panel said, it takes creativity and fortitude. And my point of view, which may not be shared by all my comrades in Art Against Displacement, but I think more and more, is that it's actually going to take mobilized workers as a tool to transform society. So what would it mean to organize labor toward decolonization? That's something that I'm really interested in. And we had a first little hint of that with that tower that I described at the beginning. The architecture firm that designed that tower, the workers, which is called SHOP, the workers there have an effort to unionize, which is kind of being crushed right now. But it's kind of the first opening of like, oh, what would it mean to actually collectivize so that our conditions can improve, our material conditions in our everyday lives, but also to give leverage to, greater solidarity with worker struggles. And you see this with Palestine, with like the Oakland dock workers, for example. Their union is really active on, and even the teachers' unions trying to get cops out of campuses and things like that. So it's something that I'm interested to learn more about. I thought about it for sure with Decolonize. This place has a banner that says, like, under the university and the museum, the land. So, what is our relationship as mobilized workers? And, what does a decolonized relationship to land look like? So I'm curious also if others have thoughts on that.
Thanks, Vanessa. John, do you want to weigh in on this? What does the decolonized future look like? And is abolition the only road?
I would say, in short, I think yes. I think a longer, more thorough response, even though not a complete response, because it's never, decolonization isn't something where I can point at a picture and say that's what it's going to look like. I think that it's something that we are constantly building, right? Like we're there's this saying, like, we're flying the plane, or we're building the plane as we fly it, is a saying that I really like, because I feel like as we build towards that future, that horizon, as we build to abolish these structures, and as people generally committed to abolishing the current order of things, which place too many people at the bottom and at the mercy of the very few rich and powerful people, specifically within the US and the global north more broadly. I think that it takes that kind of imagination that we can only get by working towards it every single day. Decolonization of Palestine particularly, this has been a saying in the Palestine movement for a while, but like, abolish Israel, right? We need to completely dismantle Zionism. We need to eradicate Zionism, because freeing Palestine means destroying and ending this settler colonial movement. And I think, very similarly in the United States, especially when we talk about police are the people protecting the property, protecting whiteness. And just as, you have US soldiers occupying so many places in the Middle East, for example, to protect US property abroad, to protect imperial interests, you have the police here serving as that kind of domestic army that is protecting capitalist interests within the US, within the borders of the United States. And I think that what we learned from 2020 and what we're continuing to learn every time anything happens, quite literally, is that the police do not keep us safe, and that we need to continue to build for a future without policing, without prisons, because they're particular institutions that enshrine and uphold the current order of things. And our mission, I believe, is to eradicate the current order of things, is to restructure things and to build something new, something much more human, something that gives dignity and life and fulfillment to far more people.
Thanks so much, John. Amin or Crystal, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, I just wanted to tie this in to what others have been saying so far, and relate it to what I actually do as my day job. I am a lawyer and I represent tenants. And so New York City has been doing a lot of these things lately, right to counsel, give every tenant a lawyer, as if that is just gonna solve all the problem. But I don't see my day job as resisting settler colonialism. Everything I do is operating within that colonial system. So I can try to make the least bad things happen for my clients, but I'm not, helping them escape the system. But when we say something like abolish landlords, abolish a system that would allow people to be made homeless for someone else's profit and money, that changes the conversation. I don't know what else. Do you want to add anything?
Can I just, oh, sorry, please. Look.
I was just gonna say a few things. One, by saying that and being fully transparent, in this conversation, especially that we're in on a platform with future and current legal minds. And it goes back to Olayinka's point in regards to language, right? Making this the statement of defunding the police has become a tagline, a bumper sticker. And as one who grew up in Brooklyn during the crack epidemic, I understand exactly how the streets in New York were and how police were, and actually saw the stop and frisk movement really destroy my community that I born in and still live in to this day. We have to be careful of using certain slogans. Defunding the police needs to be thrown out, because it's not taken away from the police. It is taking back the money that was taken away from education, from social workers, from mental health, from housing. We need to be very clear in our language that we need to refund education. We need to refund housing, advocacy work. We need to refund after-school programs. I am in a building that has only one after-school program that services a handful of children compared to the students that go into that building. There are thousands of schools in New York City that are trying to find ways, scraping, to have after-school programs, extracurricular activities, our summer youth employment programs for our young people. During the Giuliani administration, he took all of that out. I remember advocating for that. And that's where that money went to, policing. If you look at the New York City Police Department, a large number of our officers are officers of color. And when you ask them why they decided to become police officers, it's because they wanted to make a change in the community that they lived in. So I am for policing appropriately. And as I go back to the point of looking at the bigger picture, we have to look at who are the people at One Police Plaza that is designing the training to assist officers in this mindset that when you see a person of color, they are a criminal before finding out whether or not they've done anything wrong. And that's where we need to bridge the gap. I think when we use certain languages, we continue this same colonial work of them versus us. And when you have that wall up, no one is going to talk. No one wants to speak to someone if they think that the other person judges them another way. So I wanted to say that because I hear people saying it, but they're not saying the solution. They're not coming up with a solution. Defunding the police is not going to help if you take that money and you put it into something that's not going to benefit the community. So I just wanted to put that there. And in regards to what a decolonized world will be, as the Sankofa term is of going back to the past and bringing forward what is useful, we had that. I think of Black Wall Street, and it was a thriving community that survived on its own. However, because of the hatred and racial divide, the idea of someone that was non-white thriving, it had to be destroyed in their eyes. So if we can live in a world moving forward, we have examples of that. We just have to change the system and the people in the system. And if we don't go out there and vote people in, if we don't try to rally up young people to become future leaders, then we're going to continue to have these conversations, and it will be more of a dream than a reality. I'm very optimistic, and especially the work of the African Burial Ground Coalition, that when you put community members together, anything can happen. The power of the voice cannot be silent when people know the truth. And whether or not there is a seat at the table, as Shirley Chisholm would say, let us bring our folding tables and make people hear us, force them. That is what democracy is about. We are the people. And whether they acknowledge us, they have taken that oath, and we need to hold people accountable. I think that's the other issue. The other challenge is holding people accountable. Whether we voted for them or not, we have to hold them accountable because they represent us, not the people who they think they represent. So I wanted to make that clear, because I hear certain things and I have conversations with people, and we will continue to divide ourselves and not be successful if we're not clear in our messaging and as well as the language that we use.
So first of all, I just want to say, I know we've got about 10 to 15 minutes left. I want to make sure that if there are any additional questions from our audience, we have a chance to address those. There are some there, I think, that the panelists can see, so you're also welcome to respond in writing if you'd like. I just want to note that, it sounds like, Samantha, that you believe that there is a way to achieve at least some semblance of justice or some semblance of decolonization, even within some of the structures that we're operating in now. And we know that there are folks, including some of our panelists, who believe that we need to tear down the entire thing and start from scratch. And I think it really just points to why it's so important for us to stay in dialogue, right? And to continue to build with one another and find ways to move forward and figure out, what the next steps are and how do we convince everyone else to get on board. Because as I said, I feel like we may have disagreements at the edges, but there's some, I think, general agreement among the folks who are doing this work that it's important and it's urgent, but not necessarily so among sort of mainstream America. Trisha, I wanted to give you a chance to jump in on this in case you had anything you wanted to add, and then we'll see if we have any other questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's a lot to say. The piece about language and not letting the sloganness, the sexiness of these words, like the wokeness of these words, trump what they actually mean and what we're actually trying to accomplish. For me, Decolonized Future, I feel like it's about, it definitely will require abolition. And again, it's like, what definition of abolition are you using? For me personally, I look to the abolitionists of, the 1800s, who in New York, because New York was a slave state, Brooklyn had a very active abolitionist history. And those folks were willing to put their lives on the line for people who were in the community, people who didn't look like them. They used whatever resources they had to end slavery as best they could. And so I feel like it's going to take that level of commitment, whatever that looks like for individual people. Like, how far are you willing to go for these causes that you hear about, that affect you, that affect people that you know, that affect people that you care about? I think also it's, for me, when I think about words again, we talk about reparations, like wanting reparations for the harm that's been done. I personally don't believe there's like a number that you can put on that. The government can't repair with money what was stolen, what was lost. And so I feel like it's more about recompense, actually compensating people for labor in terms of enslaved Africans that went unpaid. New York, there's all these streets that are named after slave owners. There's so much generational wealth that people are enjoying to this day that doesn't belong to them. It doesn't belong to them. And so honestly, only God can can do the thing to make that wealth come into people's hands and who it belongs to. But yeah, I think that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Trisha. And I think we've touched on this to some degree, but I want to ask one of the audience questions, which is, what does it mean to do your respective organizing efforts on unceded Lenape lands? And how do you prevent Indigenous erasure, I assume in the context of the work that you do? So maybe this goes in part to this interconnectedness that we're talking about, but how do you stay mindful of that erasure that is sort of foundational to this country in the work that you do on a day-to-day basis? And this is for anyone. We don't necessarily have to have everyone try to tackle it, but anyone who wants to give it a shot.
I mean, I could say something about that. Again, I think the question, of course, you want to be cognizant of erasure, but that's harm reduction. The question is, what are you engaged in? What are you for? What do you desire? What paradigm are you working towards? The concept of freedom is a concept we're not familiar. We don't even know how to be free. Freedom looks differently for different people. The idea of reparations around enslavement, are we talking monetary or otherwise? Is it reparations that go back into a struggle for resistance and liberation globally? Debts that are owed elsewhere to each other? Can that be the basis of a social fabric for our world yet to come that we're creating in the moment? You're right, it's around language, and it's around everything is in the language, but we're at a different conjuncture where it's about how do we move together? Right now, the issue is like, it's not that Black folks need to get reparations, is that the state is turning fascist. And fascism is just colonialism coming home to roost. And that comes from the Black radical tradition across CLR James and so forth. But the point that I'm trying to make is that amongst organizers, amongst us in this room, we have a wedge right now. And we have to figure out, just with a little bit more detail, how to move and how to not harm each other in bettering our lot. Because the idea of affirming this system is counter to living into life. I can agree with you around, I want to do this campaign, I want to do that campaign. But right now, the type of resistance, if it's ineffective, it props up the status quo. Propping up the status quo at a time when more people are being harmed globally and addressing the issues from a US-centric and European way is not an effective mode of organizing. We need to recognize the debts that we have to others that are not in the United States, but not only recognize it as a negative thing, recognize it as actually strength and power. Capital doesn't have borders. Borders are for bodies, and bodies are to keep us incarcerated at different levels. And apartheid exists in Detroit and in Michigan and around water. And the question is whether we're colonized or not. And some of us believe right now that we're living under colonial rule. And when we live under colonial rule, then the police is an army. The police is an army out to kill us. And the people in the police here in the North were created to discipline labor. They were created to discipline labor. The slave patrols were created in the South. That around property and slave catchers is not something that can be redeemed. Now, Is there is all the money going to the police and they're getting it from our communities and preying on them, and that's a mode of social mobility? Of course. Do we fault anyone that has that choice and not another and chooses it? No. But does that negate the fact that the police is in fact propping up the system? And right now you have Eric Adams, who is Black, as mayor after the George Floyd uprisings, come in and put the facial recognition and reduce the bail stuff and bring back the mass incarceration. Come on, we can't. We can't for the sake of our struggles collectively. So to the extent that we are working on things and we work within smaller groups and we're trying to raise consciousness, fantastic. But ultimately, this system is not redeemable. And what we mean by abolition isn't an abolition of a building or a precinct or anything like that. It's an abolition of the terms by which we are forced to live. And there isn't one way in which we can live right now. We have to figure out amongst each other in the process of struggle. So of course, amongst each other, there's difference, but we need to recognize it and respect each other and know the various traditions. It's not about decolonization and abolition in this context. It's about how do we get free? And how do we construct a we that knows how to protect itself and protect the people it loves and cares about? Because we know they force us to go in to get an education so we can all be in a rat race against each other for a job that continues to pay less over the years. And whether you're Republican or Democrat, right, or unicorns, it doesn't matter. How can we not deal with that? Tell me any person who's doing their job and they like it. Isn't that what we're talking about? We're talking about time and place and being happy. It's not about a reduction of what passed, it's about how they're fucking us over time and time again and using us against each other. And now they give us a land acknowledgement. And now we're happy with our pronouns. And now, but the identity politics really what they gave us is a politics of identity, not identity politics that goes to the Kambahi collective and intersectional struggle. Right now, what we have is something different. And yes, of course, our identities are critical to how we organize, and the specificities of struggle are essential. But how we build together, we need to do both. To recognize the debts here as on unceded territory, how does that factor into my strategies and tactics and how I move and how I imagine liberation and how I work on it and with who?
I mean, I want to acknowledge, I want to respect everyone's time. We got about 4 minutes or so left. You know, your passion for this work and just for all of the things that need to come to pass in order for us to get to where we want to go is inspiring to me and makes me hopeful, because as long as folks like you are out there doing the work, I think we have a chance. And I want to give everybody a chance to make any closing remarks they want to make, and in particular, you know, why we should be hopeful moving forward, despite the difficulty of the task in front of us. And anyone who wants to start can do that, and we'll maybe do 30 seconds or so each.
Oh,
Right. Sorry, go ahead, Vanessa.
I don't know if I have closing remarks, but I just wanted to make sure people saw in the chat, you know, I recommend that you do check out the Nanti Koklene Lenape Confederation. They're still very much an active tribe. They have, you know, I actually wrote to them by email, they responded. I worked on an exhibition about redlining, and we included some of their writing about, you know, their own concept of sovereignty, which of course predates the US government and, you know, does not derive from it. So I think there's a real need to do more. I mean, to be honest with you, I think that we need to do more, especially in the housing, you know, among housing organizers. We need to dig deeper. We need to be thinking about, you know, property. What are we talking about? What are we talking about with affordable housing? All these concepts, like we need to dig deeper to make this really radical, and to, you know, if we're going to transform our society, let's let's do it, you know, and let's center the folks who are most marginalized and who have been most harmed, and who have the vision. I mean, who have the promise of like, we need anti-capitalist ways of being. So we definitely look to them for the vision for that. As someone asked in the chat, like, what's an example of no rent forever? You know, Indigenous ways of being, there was no rent. You know, people could just live. So that's hopeful to me.
Excellent. Thanks, Vanessa. John?
When thinking about this question about hope, and especially because I do organize around Palestine particularly, I think of it as an international question. And I think about not just hope right here where we are, but hope globally. And this fact that people are coming together internationally, different ways to confront this international system of oppression. And I think there's this incredible quote by a Palestinian revolutionary named Ghassan Kanafani, where he says that imperialism has laid its body all over the world. The head in Eastern Asia, the heart in the Middle East, its arteries in Africa and Latin America. Wherever you strike it, you damage it, and you serve the world revolution. And I find that a deeply moving quote because it makes me think about the fact that you had so many people mobilizing around Palestine last summer, 2 summers ago, around Black liberation in the US, around, you know, right now we have in Latin America, these movements that are anti-imperialists, that are pushing back against US neoliberal rule that has for so long plagued the continent. You have these same things happening in Africa and Asia and all over the world. And I think that, you know, it's so easy to get hopeless when we think about just ourselves as individuals alone right here where we stand facing this giant grand empire. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of people, when they come together, can bring this empire toppling down so easily. And the people are coming together globally. We're getting closer together and we're communicating and we're learning how to actually challenge the forces of empire while building something newer, something so much better. And so I think that there is absolutely hope for the future. And I think that, you know, it might not happen tomorrow, it might not happen next week or next month or whenever, but we're coming into this time where there will be this kind of global revolution, this world revolution, as Ghassan Kanafani called it, because in many different ways all over the world, people are challenging imperialist, settler, colonial, white supremacist, capitalist rule. And every day that that happens is a day that we get closer to victory and to liberation.
Thanks so much, John. I think we may have to leave it there. I'm so sorry. I wanted to hear a little bit more from both Trisha and Sainath, but I also want to respect everyone's time. And I'm so grateful to have shared this space with all of you tonight and for everyone who was able to attend. Thanks so much for a fantastic conversation and hopefully the start of a much longer one. I'll turn it over to Kamara or whoever wants to close us out.
Hi, thank you all so much for joining us and for being here. A huge thank you to all our panelists and our moderators from today for your time and for being here and providing such wonderful insight into your campaigns and reflections on the work to date and on the path forward. Both of today's panels were so energizing and inspiring, and we're all really grateful to have been able to be here and witness it and learn from you all. So this concludes our colloquium. So thank you again to all of our panelists from both today and yesterday, and moderators from both today and yesterday, for sharing their work and reflections, insights, and calls to action with us over the past 2 days. Thanks so much again to our live captioners and our ASL and Spanish interpreters for helping us make this event as accessible as possible. And thank you to our partners, the Student Bar Association and our many student group co-sponsors, and all of our committee members and student volunteers for helping to make this event possible as well. A recording and transcript for both sessions will be available shortly at socialchangenyu.com, along with a companion Resisting Settler Colonialism, digital issue featuring works from some of our panelists, which will be coming out this spring. And we'll email you when that is posted. So we hope that everyone leaves this event with new knowledge, new perspectives, new or renowned inspiration, and new tools to resist settler colonialism in all its different forms. We hope that the Take Action resource provided via email supports you in translating the ideas and examples shared over the last 2 days into action in your own work and communities. Thank you all so much and have a good night.